that I'd like to enter into the record. It is from SIFMA, and if I may, I'd like to read a very short passage from the letter. It indicates, as SIFMA has previously testified before this committee, obviously having some sense of what we're all about, having been before the committee. This is language that I'm adding. As SIFMA has previously testified before this committee, HR 477 would expose small business owners and investors to unnecessary risk without any meaningful benefit from reduced regulatory compliance. This is a recognized entity. They speak with a fairly significant voice, and I would hope that their concerns would be given some consideration. With that, if the ranking member desires time, I'll yield to her. If not, I'll yield back to the chair.
Letters entered into the record without objection.
Does the ranking member desire any additional time? Does the ranking member desire any additional time? Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill reported favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I request a record roll call vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hands. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3903. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3903 to amend the Securities Act of 1933 to expand the ability of use testing and waters and confidential drafts registration submissions.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. And I thank the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, on his work on this bipartisan legislation, which he and I have offered together. Mr. Chairman, people with money have been getting together with people with ideas for a very long time. It's worth remembering, given the recent holiday, that the voyage of Christopher Columbus was fundamentally an investment proposition for Spain. There are real, practical consequences for getting this right. The public stock exchanges are a major way we do that now, connecting ideas and the money that makes them possible. There's mounting evidence that we've got a problem there. We've got the same number of public companies today as we did in the early 1980s, when the economy was much smaller. We're going backwards. Mr. Meeks and my bill is intended to get at this issue. There's not much we can do about the risk of the financial markets to new companies. Those are inherent risks. What we can do is focus on the regulations surrounding the process of going from a private company to a public one. We need to make sure that we reduce the process risk as much as possible without compromising investor protections. The hope is that we increase the desire of companies to go public, getting our public financial markets back to being the #1 method for capital formation. To that end, our bill does 3 things. First, it allows companies to file their paperwork for going public with the Securities Exchange Commission confidentially. That way, if there's an error or discrepancy in the documents, the company can work it out with the agency without getting embarrassed in public or exposing information to competitors. It allows all companies to confidentially file their paperwork for a second stock sale after an initial public offering. Again, the point being to allow for a dialogue between the company and the regulator. Third, it allows all companies considering an IPO to talk to sophisticated investors and qualified institutions and see if these investors might want to buy their stock before offering it to the public. This is called testing the waters. It's hard to know if you should sell a product if you can't check and see if there's anyone out there who actually wants to buy it. Together, these changes represent collaboration. Regulator and company work together to ensure that investors are protected and preparations for an IPO are complete. That's a big deal. The company still has to get it right at the end of the day. They're just not publicly damaged if they get it wrong on the first try. These options are already available to companies with smaller amounts of revenue thanks to earlier reform included in the Jobs Act, signed by President Obama in 2012. This bill would expand these options to all companies. Those initial reforms have worked really well. According to the Treasury, 88% of the companies that are eligible to access these confidential review procedures have done so. Recognizing this success, the Commission has already used its authority to implement expanded confidential paperwork filing at the staff level. I asked the chairman of the SEC at the hearing last week about what the impact of the staff level expansion had been. He said, and I quote, "The initial data is positive. Not just people using it, but people saying, 'Thank you, we intend to use it,' both from an IPO perspective, but also from the perspective of the follow-on offerings that occur in the first year. If there's any adverse views, I'd like to hear them. We haven't heard any," end quote. Less than a week ago, the Treasury Department just released a major report on improving the capital markets. The provisions of our bill were included in its recommendations to improve capital formation. Mr. Chairman, the numbers on public companies are clear. We have a problem. The experts are clear that the changes in the Budd-Meeks bill would be a positive step towards fixing this problem. Similar bipartisan reforms have seen great success in the past. I urge support, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
This is 3903. This bill would expand two provisions of the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, that is the Jobs Act of 2012, to allow all companies to meet with financially sophisticated investors to gauge interest in a contemplated stock offering, a process known as, quote, testing the waters, unquote, and to submit confidential stock registration documents to the SEC before an initial public offering, that is an IPO, for staff review. In the Jobs Act, we only allowed newly public companies known as emerging growth companies, or EGCs, to use these two provisions. According to one study of the EGCs, the testing the waters and confidentiality provisions were the most helpful provisions in encouraging IPOs. Indeed, the study found that approximately 90% of issuers used the confidential filings provision, and over 2/3 use the testing the waters provision. Smaller firms, biotech and pharmaceutical firms, and research-intensive firms are more likely to test the waters, consistent with the theory that it lowers the cost of proprietary disclosure. I find these results encouraging, and I think it is worth looking into whether these provisions will similarly help other companies and encourage them to go public. However, I am concerned that this bill creates an inflexible statutory change without any means for the SEC to scale back the use of confidentiality and testing the waters provision, even in the event of massive fraud. In June, SEC staff issued guidance allowing all issuers to submit confidential registration statements to the SEC before an IPO and for subsequent registered offerings within 1 year of the IPO. According to that guidance, quote, staff will monitor practices under the expanded processing procedures and may make modifications to limit or terminate these procedures, unquote. In addition, SEC Chairman Clayton has been very vocal in his support of finding ways to encourage companies to go public. So I think we should give some credit to the SEC for its work on these issues and encourage the agency to continue to collect data and monitor the use of these provisions before extending them to all companies. At the very least, I believe that the bill should provide the SEC the authority to limit the use of the testing the waters and confidentiality provisions as necessary and appropriate for the protection of investors. If the bill is amended to do so, I will support it. And I understand that there's supposed to be an amendment to this, so I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. who seeks recognition? Does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition? For what purpose does he seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Budd, page 2, strike line 1
Without
through
objection, the
5.
reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, there have been concerns raised with the provisions of this legislation. The suggestion has been made that there need to be guardrails in place in case there's a problem. I do not believe that problems will happen, but it's better to be safe than sorry. In the spirit of bipartisanship, I want to be responsive to those concerns. That's why I've offered this amendment, and I urge its adoption. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment?
On the amendment,
The gentlelady, for what purpose
I
does the
move to
rank?
strike the last
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I support the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Is there further discussion? Seeing no further discussion or amendment to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hands and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Chair wishes to alert members, if it's not obvious, that a vote is taking place on the floor at this time. So the committee stands in recess, pending the completion of votes. The committee will come to order now pursuant to notice. I call up H.R. 3911. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3911 to amend the Securities
Without objection, the
Exchange-
bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Move to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nearly 8 years ago, the Dodd-Frank Act provided the SEC with the ability to create a regulatory framework for broker-dealers if they choose. Yet after numerous attempts, the SEC failed to act. Unfortunately, what consumers got instead was a misguided rule implemented by the Department of Labor that created a bifurcated standard that is both confusing and harmful. To be perfectly clear, consumers need clarity, they need choice, and they need affordability. To that end, last month I introduced, sorry? Oh, Mr. Chairman, my apologies. I was so ready to spar with the ranking member that I moved to the wrong bill.
The gentlelady will be granted a do-over.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My apologies to the committee. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, H.R. 3911, the Risk-Based Credit Examinations Act of 2017, makes the criteria required in annual reporting by national recognized statistical rating organizations, NSROs, just that, risk-based. After the financial crisis, NRSROs received much of the blame, partly because they regularly gave high ratings to mortgage-backed securities. In 2010, with the passage of Dodd-Frank, these organizations were hit with new requirements aimed at enhancing their disclosures and transparency. Unfortunately, the one-size-fits-all annual reporting requirements mandated under Section 932 of Dodd-Frank placed unnecessary burdens and compliance costs on small NRSROs that were in no way the cause of the financial crisis. Contrary to what some believe, more regulation doesn't solve everything. And after the Office of Credit Ratings was created in 2012 and the new requirements went into place, smaller NRSROs found it difficult to enter the marketplace. Ironically, the large credit rating agencies, which had a hand in the financial crisis, are getting bigger as a result of regulation that is driving out small credit rating agencies. Mr. Chairman, a move to a risk-based model will alleviate the burden on small NRSROs, provide competition while continuing to maintain oversight and transparency over the industry. I want to take a second to highlight a May 2013 letter to Chairman Hensarling from former SEC Chair Mary Jo White. Former Chair White stated, and I quote, "Rather than focusing every year on each of the designated 8 review areas, allowing a risk-based approach would permit the SEC staff to tailor examinations." Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the entire letter be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Likewise, former SEC Commissioner Gallagher noted, and again I quote, "As for the NRSROs themselves, the plethora of new regulatory requirements will weigh especially heavily on smaller NRSROs and new aspirants to NRSRO status, which will have far fewer resources and therefore will be forced to devote a far higher percentage of those resources to compliance than will the larger NRSROs. I would also ask unanimous consent that his comments be entered into the record.
Without objection.
I want to be clear. This bill does not eliminate reporting requirements for credit rating agencies. Instead, it simply makes the criteria required in an annual report risk-based. Large credit rating agencies will still be held accountable while allowing real competition in the market. I want to take a moment and thank Congressman Foster for his support last Congress, as well as his support here today. Mr. Chairman, I urge all my colleagues to support this very bipartisan, common-sense legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. H.R. 3911 would give SEC staff the discretion to focus on the most high-risk areas when conducting annual examinations of certain credit rating agencies known as nationally recognized statistical rating organizations, that is, NRSROs. In the years leading up to the subprime mortgage crisis, credit rating agencies operating under conflicts of interest enable Wall Street's reckless conduct by routinely assigning inflated credit ratings to high-risk structured mortgage products. These overblown ratings allowed banks to assume unreasonable amounts of risk, which cost Americans trillions of dollars when the mortgages underlying these securities began to default. In the wake of the ensuing global financial crisis, the Dodd-Frank Act strengthened oversight of credit rating agencies, including by directing the SEC to create an Office of Credit Ratings responsible for conducting annual examinations of NRSROs. Currently, each NRSRO examination must include a review of 8 topic areas designed to assess the adequacy of each agency's internal controls, conflicts of interest, and rating methodologies, among other areas. HR 3911 would allow SEC staff to take a risk-based approach to annual NRSRO examinations, thereby focusing valuable resources on the areas where problematic conduct is most likely to exist. Unlike many of the bills in today's markup, HR 3911 represents a common-sense piece of legislation that enhances rather than hampers effective oversight by financial regulators. I've heard the concerns raised by investor advocacy groups like the Consumer Federation of America that affording the SEC too much discretion on NRSRO examinations would lead to reduced accountability for entities that played a central role in the 2008 financial crisis. I have no interest in returning to the bad old days when credit rating agencies, mega banks, and Wall Street were permitted to run amok at the expense of American taxpayers. That is why I'm pleased that this legislation preserved Dodd-Frank's requirements that the SEC conduct an examination of each NRSRO, at least for these reasons. I support this bill and thank Representatives Foster and Wagner for their bipartisan work. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just want to congratulate my...
Move strike the last
I'm
word.
sorry,
Gentleman
yes.
is recognized
Yes.
for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, can I have a do-over, please? Take 2. Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is once again recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I just want to say congratulations to my colleague from Missouri and her fine work on this, and having bipartisan support is significant. And I too ask that we move ahead on this as chairman of the Capital Markets with working with the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is common sense. And with that, I yield back.
Yield to the chairman.
Be happy to,
And
sir.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to add my voice to the chorus, thanking the gentlelady from Missouri for her leadership here. Clearly, we need more competition among our NRSROs. Currently, we have barriers to entry, and I think that this particular act will help make it a little bit easier to have competition, which is clearly something we need in this market. I appreciate her working on a bipartisan basis. I appreciate the ranking member's support. I urge all members to adopt this. I yield back to the gentleman from Michigan.
And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? If there's no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill reported favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. For what purpose does gentlelady from Missouri seek recognition?
I'm sorry, I'd like a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3857. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3857 to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word again.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Nearly 8 years ago, the Dodd-Frank Act provided the SEC with the ability to create a regulatory framework for broker-dealers if they choose. Yet after numerous attempts, the SEC failed to act. Unfortunately, what consumers got instead was a misguided rule implemented by the Department of Labor that created a bifurcated standard that is both confusing and harmful. To be perfectly clear, consumers need clarity, they need choice, and they need affordability. And to that end, last month, I introduced H.R. 3857, the Protecting Advice for Small Savers Act. The PASS Act of 2017 would repeal the Department of Labor's fiduciary rule and finally create a best interest standard that protects investors without limiting their access to investment products. In addition, the bill requires broker-dealers to disclose any compensation they receive or conflicts that might exist. And the PASS Act of 2017 reestablishes the SEC as the rightful regulator in this space. Finally, my bill ensures states such as Nevada don't make their own fiduciary standard, creating a patchwork that will only further complicate matters. I realize, Mr. Chairman, that the National Association of Insurance Commissioners has some concerns, and I want to assure the commissioners we will do our best to address those concerns and look forward to working with them as we go forward. Mr. Chairman, my friends on the other side of the aisle might not want to admit it, but SEC Chairman Clayton said it himself. Quote, there will be changes to the DOL fiduciary rule. And while I am happy to have Chairman Clayton as a willing partner in this fight, I do believe Congress needs to reassert its authority in this space. Just last week, in his testimony before this committee, Chairman Jay Clayton said, I quote, you can't put one hat on when you're talking about 50% of your assets and another hat on when you're talking about another 50%. It makes no sense. In other words, when the average American is sitting across from a broker-dealer and maybe has 2 different accounts with them, there should be one standard for all services provided. Although I was happy to see the 18-month delay earlier this year, low and middle-income investors are hurting now. While the previous administration failed to listen, many, myself included, knew that broker-dealers would be forced to drop small investors, move to fee-based accounts, and refer clients to so-called robo-advisors. In fact, a recent Wall Street Journal article notes Wall Street has been given a gift. The story says, and I quote, firms are pushing customers towards accounts that charge an annual fee on their assets rather than commissions, and such fee-based accounts have long been more lucrative for the industry. In earnings calls, executives are citing the Department of Labor rule as a boon. Furthermore, multiple independent studies conducted since the rule took effect in June have shown that access to investment products have decreased. Those studies, which have been submitted in the comment letter, show an alarming trend. In a survey of roughly half of the financial advisors in the United States, access to brokerage advice services have either been eliminated altogether or greatly reduced since the DOL rule took effect. In addition, the survey found that 95% of the respondents have made changes to the products available to investors. Another study found that 75% of broker-dealers will service fewer small accounts due to increased risk and compliance costs. Mr. Chairman, it is very simple. We must pass legislation that protects a saver's ability to have access to affordable products, period. This is not about Wall Street. It's about low and middle income savers on Main Street. I urge all my colleagues to support the PASS Act of 2017, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady recognized for 5 minutes.
I was pleased to support the gentlelady from Missouri's last bill, but not this one. Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last words so that I could explain for 4 months now, the Department of Labor's fiduciary rule has protected American seniors and retirement savers from conflicted advice about their retirement assets. Prior to that time, unscrupulous salespeople masquerading as financial advisors were legally able to provide retirement savers with conflicted investment advice that lined their own pockets but cost saviors $17 billion each year. But if Representative Wagner and the Trump administration have their way, this victory for American seniors will be short-lived. H.R. 3857 would repeal the DOL fiduciary rule and replace it with a less protective suitability standard for investment advice under the securities laws that would allow brokers to put their own financial interest in fees and kickbacks ahead of their clients' interests. Mr. Chairman, this makes no sense. Many registered investment advisors and other financial advisors that already abide by a fiduciary standard support the DOL's fiduciary rule, as do consumer, labor, and retirement groups. Those groups include the Financial Planning Coalition, AARP, AFL-CIO, NAACP, and Consumer Federation of America. In addition, 9 in 10 Americans reportedly agree with the DOL's rule. An overwhelming majority of around 65% of Americans who voted for President Trump also appear to support the rule. I'd also remind my colleagues that the first phase of the DOL's rule went out in June, and contrary to its opponents' claims, it did not send the financial services industry into a tailspin. Accordingly, to the head of client experience and growth at Wells Fargo, quote, "It went very smoothly. I would liken it to Y2K. We did a lot of preparation and a lot of work for a day that ended up feeling a lot like any other day," end of quote. What's more, Republicans already tried to repeal the DOL's rule last Congress through the Congressional Review Act. House Democrats unanimously opposed the measure, which was subsequently vetoed by President Obama. Undeterred, House Republicans sought to override the veto, which again, Democrats unanimously opposed. So, Mr. Chairman, a repeal at this point just doesn't make sense. That's why I will be introducing legislation that says that if the SEC issues fiduciary rules pursuant to Section 913 of the Dodd-Frank Act, such rules shall be no less stringent than the fiduciary rule as promulgated by the DOL. So I strongly oppose H.R. 3857 and urge my colleagues to join me in voting against it. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, folks, we need to realize how this came about. And the pure and simple fact is, when Dodd-Frank handed the obligation to the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the primary agency that deals in this question of who represents you and I when we are out there investing our funds, our hard-earned funds, they couldn't come up with a definition that suited the Obama administration. When that happened, the last administration decided to pull it from the experts and hand it off to a political hack. The person that is now the head of the Democratic Party, who was serving as Secretary of Labor at the time, who would then sculpt a definition that suited their political ends. We have to just be honest about this. And it's okay. They won the election. They had the ability to do this. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it good for consumers. And we know that, in fact, those mom and pop, Mr. and Mrs. 401k investors are being harmed by this rule. I've talked to a number of folks that have been involved in this, including customers. And I'm not talking Wall Street. I'm talking literally Main Street in Zeeland, my hometown, 8th Street in Holland, Shoreline Drive in Muskegon, and numerous other places that all of my colleagues I know have gone to talk to experts in this field, and maybe even the same people that they do their own investing with, to understand where the real hang-up is on this. And the bottom line is customers are being forced into fee-based accounts, which not only typically are more expensive to service, but offer diminished retirement account returns over time. Typically, you would think of somebody who's going to be doing a fee-based kind of investing as someone who's got quite a bit of money. And they might be kind of savvy, and they're leaning in on this, and they're going to turn this decision-making over to an expert, but they're going to be heavily engaged in this. That That isn't the case when you are dealing with the average investor here in America. Those fees are absolutely killing them. They're eating into what should be cash being used to grow on a compound basis. So, this bill, HR 3857, creates a best interest standard that is unique and appropriately designed for broker-dealers. It's defining the best interest standard. The bill incorporates many of the regulatory requirements prescribed in broker-dealers currently through FINRA guidance while enhancing the overall set of requirements imposed on broker-dealers. We are trying to make sure that our investors are safe. We're trying to make sure that their nest eggs are safe. What unfortunately has happened and where we have found ourselves today is that the very people that we are trying to protect, or that some say that they are trying to protect, are being harmed by this action. And what this bill does is it reestablishes the Securities and Exchange Commission as the expert regulator for broker-dealers and the products they sell to retail customers, exactly the way it should be. Right now, with the Department of Labor's ruling, we are having the tail wag the dog. And that is not right. And I want to commend the gentlelady from Missouri and her work. She has been relentless on this, and rightfully so. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes? Gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition.
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Members, I just want to point out to you that this battle over the fiduciary rule that we're talking about now has been going on for 15 years. And it's been led by consumer advocates and people who advocate for the best interests of seniors, like AAPRP, Consumer Federation of America, groups like that. In fact, the effort, the fight, really was not, Tom Perez certainly was the Secretary of Labor. I think he did a wonderful job at that, in that role, but the real person pulling the heavy oar was Phyllis Borsey, who is a professional and an expert in this area. So my friend from Michigan, I just want to say that it really wasn't about a political hack. That really wasn't what was going on. Really what's going on is, if you leave your job, you're likely to get a call from somebody, a salesperson, who wants to manage your rollover of your 403B or 401K into an IRA. The people calling you they're not financial advisors. They are salespeople who can take money out of your account to compensate them for the rollover, say 5% commission, and give you retirement funds with high fees that strip wealth out of your plan. One of the legacies of the Obama administration is a requirement that any investment funds derived from the workplace investment be dedicated to a client's best interest. That seems self-evident to me. It seems like the right thing. Yet, the bill being offered now, I think would prevent this best interest standard from becoming law. In fact, the President's national security, what we've seen from the Trump administration, compared high commission and fee accounts and retirement plans to people wanting to eat junk food. I don't know about but I doubt there are any people out there who think that investing for a secure retirement is a lightweight choice like that. It's a weighty choice. It's a huge choice. And nowadays, as people have switched from secured benefit plan to secure contribution plans, it's just a much tougher environment, and the government should step in to make sure that the best interests of the investor saver is being looked after. For those reasons, I would urge members to vote no on this particular measure, and I think if you vote no, you'll be voting yes for retirees and savers and small investors.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to echo the remarks of some of my colleagues have made on this issue. This rule is going to have major ramifications, and I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of this legislation. What I think is interesting about this debate is that many support a best interest standard, but many oppose the fiduciary rule as it's currently structured. What I think that's coming from is expertise. This is a rule that's properly in the realm of the Securities and Exchange Commission. We are very far from the Department of Labor's core expertise. Everyone here is aware of the sobering numbers on financial literacy in this country. 2/3 of Americans cannot pass a basic test of financial knowledge. What I don't understand is why it's a good idea to dispatch the wrong agency to put forward a broad-based rule that will substantially impact the ability of financial advisors to even give advice. The fiduciary rule is the equivalent of a hammer swung by an amateur, and the PASS Act replaces it with a scalpel wielded by a professional. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Congresswoman Ann Wagner for her dedication in working to correct all of the issues created regarding the prior administration's proposal to create a new fiduciary standard for retirement accounts. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of her new legislation, the PASS Act, protecting advice for small savers, because I believe Congress has a responsibility for setting policy, especially policy as significant as this, not the regulators. The situation we find ourselves in today is extremely unfortunate given the alarms raised by members of this committee regarding President Obama's efforts to institute more regulations on retirement accounts. Many of our concerns are coming to fruition. There's increased confusion about what the standard of care that is being provided to investors for disparate financial products. There also is regulatory uncertainty given the very serious legal questions that are raised by the prior administration and the lack of clarity for how the SEC will attempt to institute a harmonized standard. And of greatest concern, investors are losing access to retirement advice, just as this committee forewarned. The PASS Act recognizes that broker-dealers engage in different securities activities than investment advisors and creates a best interest standard that is tailored for broker-dealers. In defining the best interest standard, the bill incorporates many of the regulatory requirements already prescribed to broker-dealers currently through FINRA guidance, while enhancing the requirements imposed on broker-dealers. Specifically, under the best interest standard, a broker-dealer must act in the retail customer's best interest while providing a recommendation. The bill also requires increased disclosures to the customer before buying a securities project on behalf of that customer. The bill also reaffirms that the SEC is the expert regulator for investor protection and the primary regulator of broker-dealers and the products that they sell to retail customers. I raised serious concerns about the Department of Labor's fiduciary as far back as 2015. For me, the most concerning aspect of that proposal was that it rests on a claim that many advisors serve their own interests, not the interests of their customers. However, as in any successful business in a competitive market, financial professionals must build trust with their customers over years of working together. Advisors who get a bad name promoting their own self-interest will jeopardize their clients' money, and they can't stay in business long. I worked with my colleagues in the Illinois delegation and this committee to send 2 letters to the Department of Labor. These were largely ignored, other than a brief response that was simply confirming that the letters were received. I wish the prior administration had been more willing to work with Congress and the SEC to come up with better solutions. Instead, we're now stuck with trying to clean up the issues that they created. Most members of the committee know that almost 40 million households have not saved anything for retirement, and 62% of Americans aged 55 to 64 have less than 1 year's savings. The new rules from the prior administration have regulatory costs that would hit small savers the hardest, especially the 98% of the as many as 35 million of IRA accounts with less than $25,000, which depend on brokerage relationships. Here's an example of how this will hurt my district. State Farm, headquartered in Illinois, and with agents across the state, will only sell and service mutual funds, variable products, and tax-qualified bank deposit products through a self-directed customer call center. According to an article published by Investment News last October, this decision affects 12,000 State Farm agents around the country licensed to sell securities, 2/3 of the company's 18,000 total agents. And I quote from them, "Our self-directed call center representatives will make information and resources available to customers who will make their own decisions regarding their investments." That was said by Ms. Reisinger in an emailed statement. In closing, again, I'd like to thank Ms. Wagner for proposing a constructive solution to the restrictive policies currently faced by investors in our communities. And I would urge all of my colleagues to support this important act and for us to pass the PASS Act. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to congratulate my colleague, Mrs. Wagner from Missouri, for her work on this very important piece of legislation. And what's striking about this bill is that it represents something. It's a taking back of power from unelected bureaucrats and putting it in the hands of the people's representatives. This bill, you read it, and it strikes me as that there's some legislating going on by the branch of government that's supposed to do the legislating as the founders envisioned it. I'm impressed with the work that Mrs. Wagner put into this, talking of responsibility to meet a customer's best interest. Quote, this is the law, the bill that she has proposed. When a broker or dealer makes a recommendation to a retail customer, the recommendation shall be in the retail customer's best interest. HR 3857 speaks of a broker-dealer's duty to use reasonable care, skill, and prudence. It directs that the broker-dealer shall disclose prior to the point of sale to such customer in clear and concise manner the type and scope of services the broker or dealer provides, the standard of conduct that applies to the relationship, the types of compensation the broker or dealer receives, any material conflict of interest. This is the art of legislating that Mrs. Wagner has engaged in as envisioned by the founders. In practice, this bill is going to allow more consumer choice. A consumer will have options. Perhaps the consumer would like to go into a relationship where the fee is commission-based or fee-based. This empowers consumers, and it offers small savers an opportunity to get personal service. What's wrong with consumer choice? I really commend all the work that has gone into this piece of legislation. It represents government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and I urge my colleagues to support this legislation.
Would you yield to the chairman?
I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I, too, want to commend the gentlelady from Missouri. She has been the leader in the House on the issue of ensuring that really small savers have the opportunity to keep the accounts that they have and to make sure that the Department of Labor, which has absolutely no business in this space, has absolutely no expertise in this space, does not essentially take their investment advisor or broker-dealer away from them. And broker-dealers and investment advisors are two fundamentally different groups of people. And as the gentleman from Pennsylvania said, in a free society, people ought to have the freedom to choose which they want. And in some respects, we are deciding that hopefully people will have an opportunity to either choose a commission-based investment system or a fee-based investment advising system. And so the gentlelady from Missouri provides better disclosure. And yes, there does need to be better disclosure. People need to appreciate the difference between the two. But again, we know that quite often rules have inadvertent consequences, unintended consequences. And so already we know that people in some places are already losing their investment advisor today because of the DLO fiduciary rule. So this is a common sense approach that the gentlelady has taken, and also to echo what the gentleman from Pennsylvania said, it is an exercise in Article I authority. And that is, we here in Congress make the laws. And we should be very reticent to yield that power to the unaccountable and unelected. And so the gentlelady from Missouri has invested more time and more effort in pursuing this issue, studying this issue, and I agree with her approach, and I think it will be very helpful to our markets, it will be very helpful to the elderly, it will be very helpful to small savers. And in a free society, people ought to have that freedom of choice. I applaud her for her work. I yield back to the gentleman from Pennsylvania. I assume he yields back. Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank you. I think everything maybe has been said on this subject, but it hasn't been said by everyone. And I also want to add my nickel's worth here. I know everyone has the same goal of trying to protect people from unscrupulous advisors. I certainly share that goal. And there are communities of seniors around this country where there's a large population of seniors. I represent one of those in New Jersey. And the question is, how do we protect people without overly orchestrating an entire industry? I think the gentlelady has done a good job of trying to fix the overreach of the fiduciary standards. In my experience, multiple standards create confusion, and there has been confusion in this area. Confusion increases risk. Risk results in aversion. And risk aversion results in limited choices and too much expense. And that's exactly what we've had. We need a single regulator, and this bill has achieved that and put it at the best regulator for this subject, the SEC. We need a single standard. And this bill has defined a rigorous standard, best interest standard, that makes advisors put their clients' interests first. We don't need government-directed investments. We don't need to drive every senior into U.S. Treasuries and nothing else because the advisor feels it's risk-averse to do anything otherwise. And that's exactly what will result from the status quo. Advisors will push seniors into U.S. Treasuries and nothing else. And that would really be an unfortunate result for people that are living longer and need to save more. So I applaud the gentlelady. I support the bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it as well, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to support my friend from Missouri's PASS Act. Every time I go home, I hear from my constituents that they're tired of Washington bureaucrats following political agendas, picking winners and losers in this country. They're tired of the top-down Washington knows best policy that limits choices and options for Americans because Washington thinks business is bad, business can't be trusted, and Washington to the rescue. They know what's best for middle America. This arrogance is a real problem. What we have is a federal government telling middle America, you can't be trusted to make your own financial decisions. We know better. Such arrogance from a government that has given us, and the clock says, $20.2 trillion of debt. We've heard plenty of people speak in support of the PASS Act. I'll tell you, we're already seeing the adverse effects of the fiduciary rule. Small business plan advisors are forced to change their business models, raising costs for consumers. There's been an elimination of commission-based retirement accounts and an increase in fee-based accounts, which are typically more costly and less profitable for everyday Americans. The PASS Act offers desperately needed relief for America's low and middle-income investors. It creates a best interest standard that's unique and appropriately designed for broker-dealers. And the standard includes many of the same consumer protection regulations under current law and has the SEC as the expert regulator, as they should be, of the broker-dealers and the products they sell to everyday Americans. I proudly support the PASS Act and yield to my friend from Missouri.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I think it's important to correct the record. The former administration incorrectly estimated that conflicted advice by broker-dealers costs retirees some $17 billion in lost returns annually. However, there is no study that directly supports this estimated cost. In addition, the DOL fails to consider the costs imposed on investors, particularly with low and middle incomes that are shut out from investment advice or are forced to enter fee-based accounts, which are more expensive than commission-based accounts. There are no studies showing that significant numbers of retail investors are being harmed by the suitability standard that currently applies to broker-dealers. Again, let me reiterate, the best interest standard in my legislation represents a workable best interest standard that improves upon the suitability standard without pricing investors with smaller accounts out of the market. Furthermore, the best interest standard in my legislation applies to all accounts, including both retirement and investment, and not just retirement accounts as under the DOL rule. Let's all come together, legislate as a Congress, do not abrogate our responsibility to unelected bureaucrats in agencies. I have spent the better part of the last 5 years, Mr. Chairman, fighting for those small and middle income savers. As many of my colleagues have noted, we are indeed in the middle of a savings crisis. We must make it affordable with choice and access for that low and middle income saver on Main Street to put some money away for their future. I urge passage of H.R. 3857. I thank my colleagues for their support in what has been an entire committee effort here on capital markets, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
I yield back to the chairman.
A gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose? No. Okay. If no one seeks recognition, there being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill reported favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to, for what purpose does the ranking member?
Unanimous consent request. I'd like to enter into the record the many letters.
I'm sorry, the gentlelady's microphone isn't on.
I have a unanimous consent request. I'd like to enter into the record the many letters from the many organizations opposing H.R. 3857.
Without objection. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3973. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3972, to clarify that family offices...
I'm sorry, 3972. 3972. I misspoke. Clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3972, to clarify that family offices and family clients...
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Well, the chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, the sponsor of the legislation, to offer an amendment. So we will pause for a moment and allow the amendment to be distributed. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Maloney. Page 1, line
Without objection, the
strike.
reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentlelady from New York is recognized on her amendment.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill is simple and makes what I consider to be a technical fix to the rules for family offices. Family offices are entities that are established by wealthy families to manage their own wealth and to provide financial services to their family members. The original family office was created by John D. Rockefeller 125 years ago in 1892, and it's still located in the district I'm privileged to serve. Family offices have had a long and storied history in our country. Family offices aren't regulated by the SEC as an investment advisors because they don't have traditional clients or outside investors that invest money in their funds like other investment advisors. A family office is just a wealthy family managing their own money. Their clients are primarily family members, and disputes between family members are better handled either internally by the family or through state courts, which have laws to govern disputes between family members. Prior to Dodd-Frank, the SEC had been exempting family offices from the Advisors Act for decades on a case-by-case basis. In Dodd-Frank, we codified the exemption for family offices and required the SEC to write a rule formally defining family offices. The SEC finalized that rule in 2011, so family offices that meet the SEC's definition do not have to register with the SEC as investment advisors. However, a problem has now come up that we did not anticipate. We assumed that every family client of a family office would be wealthy and would thus qualify as a sophisticated accredited investor under the SEC rules, since family officers are specifically set up for these families. But it turns out that there are very limited circumstances in which a family client of a family office may not actually qualify as an accredited investor. For example, a 18, 19, 20-year-old member may be in his or her first job after school and may not be making enough money yet to qualify as an accredited investor, which normally requires that you make over $200,000 a year. And the real problem is that if just one of these family clients in a family office is not an accredited investor, then the entire family office cannot buy any securities that are limited to accredited investors, like privately issued stocks and bonds. My bill would fix this by just clarifying that all family offices and family clients are, in fact, accredited investors. The bill includes some important limitations to ensure that only truly wealthy families using family offices who can fend for themselves are being treated as accredited investors. Under the bill, the family office has to have at least $5 million in assets under management, which is the same limitation that applies to trusts in the current accredited investor rule. The family office also has to have its investments directed by a sophisticated investment professional, which provides yet another layer of protection. So really, this bill, this bill is very narrowly tailored and provides what I consider to be a technical fix that will allow family offices to better serve their own family members. I want to thank the chairman for putting this bill on the roster today and for the support of his staff and my own staff in putting this forward. This happens to be very important to many people that I represent. I think it's reasonable and common sense and fair, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? For what purposes gentlemen from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I will ask to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll wrap this up with both the amendment and I think, because I believe that's what we were speaking to, as well as my support for the bill. And while I will point out it would have been helpful to have had this amendment last evening, apparently when it was printed at 9:54 p.m., according to the bottom of the sheet, we're just seeing this for the first time, but it looks like this is a positive step and something that I can and do support. And as my colleague from New York has pointed out, it's been helpful working with her on this particular issue, and providing this technical clarification to have them be considered accredited investors under Reg D is, I believe, the right direction to go. So, Mr. Chairman, I just want to lend my support to both this amendment and to the underlying bill and the issue that we are trying to get at. With that, I am happy to yield.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'm happy to yield to my colleague.
I greatly appreciate your support and friendship, and I'm deeply grateful on behalf of my constituents that this will benefit. Thank you. I yield back.
No problem. And, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank Representative Maloney for offering this amendment to ensure that the family offices and family clients that take advantage of this bill are in fact financially sophisticated enough to be deemed accredited investors. Specifically, the amendment would apply the same standards currently in place for trusts, so that a family office must have assets greater than $5 million, and a family office and family client not be formed for the specific purpose of acquiring the securities offered and be directed by a sophisticated person. The amendment would also clarify that the family client must be a client of the family office. I support these changes. If adopted, I will support the bill. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Is there any further discussion or amendments to the bill? If not, the question now occurs on ordering the bill as amended reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. Sufficient number having raised their hand, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 or Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3973. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3973 to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to sponsor H.R. 3973, the Market Data Protection Act. I am very grateful for the support of the Democrat lead co-sponsor of this bill, Mr. Sherman. Also, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Henschling, for including this bill in the markup today. The Securities and Exchange Commission disclosed on September 20th, 2017, that hackers breached its EDGAR database, on which the regulator stores millions of public and non-public filings, which may have led to illicit trading activities. The SEC's disclosure came just weeks after Equifax announced the company had been a victim of an attack that resulted in the theft of personal data of over 145 million Americans. Such incidents raise questions about the SEC's internal cybersecurity controls, in particular, the Commission's ability to safeguard the forthcoming consolidated audit trail market data. Once the consolidated audit trail is fully implemented, it will collect information on every order, cancellation, and trade for all equities and options across all U.S. markets. The consolidated audit trail will give the SEC access to sensitive information such as taxpayer identification numbers, legal entity identifiers, social security numbers, making the consolidated audit trail a prime target for cyber attacks. Members of Congress and market participants have raised concerns regarding the safety of market data, especially in light of recent reports by GAO that identified weaknesses in the SEC's data security systems. For these reasons, I ask all of you to help pass H.R. 3973, the Market Data Protection Act. First, the bill would amend the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934, requiring the SEC to develop and implement risk controls to safeguard all market data. Second, the bill would require the SEC, FINRA, and the Consolidated Audit Trail operator to establish risk controls to protect data stored by those entities. Lastly, H.R. 3973 will prohibit the Consolidated Audit Trail operator from accepting data until these controls are developed. Additional measures must be taken to ensure the ongoing security and confidentiality of the information with Consolidated Audit Trail and at the SEC. Cyber attacks are significant and evolving. While I support the Consolidated Audit Trail's ability to assist the SEC in identifying and addressing bad actors, Congress needs to make sure that the SEC's house is in order before the self-regulatory organizations begin to report CAT data on November 15th of this year. We know there are severe flaws in the way SEC maintains its data and in how they've responded to and communicated errors and omissions in the past. These flaws undermine the trust and confidence of customers the SEC regulates. I believe H.R. 3973, the Market Data Protection Act, is an essential step in improving the cybersecurity deficiencies at the SEC. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes ranking members seek recognition?
Move to strike the last
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
H.R. 3973 would require the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and the operator of the Consolidated Audit Trail to adopt comprehensive mechanisms for guarding against cybersecurity risk. Following the flash crash in 2010, which saw a 1,000-point decline and recovery of U.S. stocks markets in a matter of minutes. The SEC sought to improve the existing audit trail to ensure it could quickly piece together what happened and identify malicious activity. The information collected in the CAT will be invaluable for our regulators to promote stable markets as well as to understand and fix emerging problems. However, a series of high-profile cyber attacks have exposed other disturbing vulnerabilities in our financial services industry. Just last month, Equifax disclosed that it was the target of one of the largest cybersecurity breaches in history, exposing the personally sensitive data of more than 145 million Americans. Less than 2 weeks later, the SEC chairman, Jay Clayton, announced that a 2016 hack of the SEC's public filing system, quote, may have provided the basis for illicit gain through trading, end quote. I strongly support initiatives to improve our regulators' ability to investigate harmful market disruptions and manipulative trading, and the SEC, FINRA, and the CAT plan processor must be able to carry out their regulatory and oversight functions. We also need to ensure that the collected data is protected from cyber criminals. HR 3973 does this by ensuring that the CAT is implemented with appropriate cybersecurity controls. I support the bill and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Davidson and Mr. Sherman for the work on this bill. It should be an utmost priority for each one of us to be committed to protecting the personally identifiable information of our constituents. I think government is at risk of doing more harm than good when it starts collecting this information, so we should take every precaution possible to protect the information and trust of Americans. I'm confident that every member of this committee has heard from their constituents regarding the Equifax data breach, or one of the major breaches that has happened at government agencies such as the IRS, the FDIC, or others in recent years. We should take the opportunity to learn from and respond to these failures. Congress needs to be forward-thinking in how we protect personally identifiable information. The Market Data Protection Act mandates that the SEC, FINRA, and the operator of the Consolidated Audit Trail, or CAT, in consultation with the SEC's chief economist, develop comprehensive internal risk control mechanisms to safeguard and govern the storage of market data, all market data sharing agreements, and all academic research using market data. HR 3973 also halts market data reporting to the Consolidated Audit Trail until the operator of the CAT develops such internal risk control mechanisms. This is incredibly important, and again, I support this and want to encourage all of my colleagues to support this important measure as well, and I yield back.
Would you yield to the chairman?
Absolutely.
I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. I want to thank the gentleman from Ohio for his leadership here. Again, this is an urgent piece of legislation. It is a bipartisan piece of legislation. So we know we had the SEC chairman in here recently. We all know about the Edgar data breach. We all know about the Consolidated Audit Trail that's due to go live here within a matter of weeks. It is just incredible to me the risk that are involved in PII that could unfortunately be hacked and be obtained. And so I think it is simply common sense that we have an internal risk control mechanism like the gentleman from Ohio suggests to try to safeguard this data. Again, this is a very urgent matter, and I have, again, called upon the SEC not to go live with the Consolidated Audit Trail until they can assure us that this data will be secure. And as of today, I don't think they can. At a bare minimum, we ought to ensure, enforce that they have the internal risk control mechanisms that are necessary to do that, just that. So again, I thank the gentleman, and I thank the gentleman from California as well. I yield back to the gentleman from Illinois and thank him for the time.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I would like to yield to Chairman of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, Chairman Huizenga. Balance of my time.
Thank you, and I appreciate my Vice Chairman's work on this, and also congratulations to both my colleague from Ohio and California. And to sort of echo the Chairman here, you know, what had happened with the Edgar system cannot be viewed as a victimless crime. And we need to make sure that, that it doesn't happen again. I also firmly believe that we need to hold the regulators to the same standards of those that they regulate. They would not allow a system that has failed to be utilized that way. And I just don't understand why we would put more gold into a vault that we know has been broken into. And that's really what this is. It is valuable, valuable information that is very sensitive, and we need to protect that. We need to protect people's personal identifiable information. That is of utmost importance to us. And so I want to lend my wholehearted support and appreciate the work of my colleagues on a bipartisan manner, and I yield back to the gentleman from Illinois.
I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? If there's no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill reported favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes, for what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Chairman asks for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hand, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 2148. The clerk will report the bill, which is distributed in advance.
H.R. 2148 to amend the Federal Deposit Insurance
Without
Act.
objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this important markup, including our bill, H.R. 2148, a bill to clarify the high volatility commercial real estate loan process, commonly known as HVCRE. Mr. Chairman, I would also like to thank my colleagues, Congressman Scott, Congresswoman Maloney, and the ranking member for joining our bill and making this a true bipartisan effort to create jobs and spur economic growth. Our bill proposes common sense reforms to the HVCRE loan process. In the current regulatory scheme, so-called high volatility loans maintain an overly complex and often misunderstood definition. The incredible complexity of the current HVCRE definition, created under the previous administration's Basel III initiative, causes tremendous setbacks for both banks and developers, largely impacting the blighted urban centers in our country. Mr. Chairman, when my office first began working on this initiative with House Legislative Counsel, even our own staff had difficulty understanding the current rules and identifying where Congress would even begin to improve these regulations. Basel III, as we know, was an effort by the previous administration to create initiatives to increase the capital reserves of banks, and HVCRE is a poorly defined category of development projects that require increased developer equity in order to essentially overcapitalize banking institutions. HVCRE is a designation that dramatically increases equity input requirements by developers to achieve a construction loan in certain designated high volatility circumstances. Current HVCRE rules arbitrarily limit the types of equity a developer can input to reach that heightened risk weight capital requirements. Take, for instance, the remodeling of a development, which has increased equity over the years from paying down their debt. They should not be subject to the same HVCRE standards. Unfortunately, poorly written regulations have made certain development loans too expensive, therefore reducing productivity, jobs, and community improvement. Despite numerous requests from banks and developers alike, federal regulators have failed to clarify and define the HVCRE rules and where and how they are meant to apply. Widespread industry confusion coupled with increased developer equity requirements that provide a chilling effect on the development world, particularly in the centralized urban areas that are often designated high volatility. Thus, the legislation has been crafted to address the many concerns expressed by banks and the larger real estate community, including broadening the types of equity that a developer may place towards the heightened risk requirements of an HVCRE project. The business community's backing of our legislation is demonstrated by the 11 trade associations who support this bill, which include the Mortgage Bankers Association, the National Association of Realtors, the Real Estate Roundtable, Commercial Real Estate Finance Council, and many others that have been given to each member. Rather than rely on a regulatory fix that can change from administration to administration, Congress must work to codify and improve HVRC rules to ensure market and industry stability and enhance the development in these urban centers. My bill creates the stability necessary to spur future investment, create jobs, and promote economic growth while still keeping the relevant safeguards originally intended by the HVCRE designation. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for considering H.R. 2148, and I urge all of my colleagues to support our bill through committee. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the ranking member seek
I
recognition?
move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Allow me to start by saying I appreciate the intent of the sponsors to address concerns about the complexity of capital requirements relating to high volatility commercial real estate HVCRE loans. Bank regulators have already acknowledged in their Economic Growth and Regulatory Paperwork Reduction Act report earlier this year that capital rules needed to be simplified, especially for community banks, and they would seek to simplify the requirements relating to HVCRE loans. Bank regulators followed through with that recommendation and on September 27th, released a proposal to revise capital rules and make the calculations much more straightforward. This is a good step. Some concerns I have with H.R. 2148 are that it provides a very prescriptive set of definitions relating to the capital treatment of HVCRE loans. I think we must be cautious, especially since these tend to be higher-risk loans, and we also do not know how these kind of loans and the risks they pose will evolve in the years ahead. According to the FDIC Inspector General, CRE loans generally account for more than 1/3 of community bank lending, and GAO found that the failure of many small banks in the last crisis were, quote, driven by credit losses on CRE loans, particularly loans secured by real estate to finance land development and construction, quote, unquote. So we must be cautious. I understand Representative Maloney has the amendment, and we'll offer a few important refinements to better align this proposal with the regulators' revised capital rules, and I appreciate her efforts on this. So notwithstanding my concerns, I will join my colleagues in supporting H.R. 2148 as amended, primarily as a signal to the regulators to use their authority to consider all comments on their newly proposed rule and urge them to finalize it soon after in a balanced way. And with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by thanking the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, for leading on this important piece of legislation. It should be our goal to ensure that the process of applying and receiving a loan is efficient and fair for both the consumer and the institution. We also need to ensure that concentrated lending doesn't jeopardize the economy, be it on the local or national level. At the same time, we cannot have a regulatory regime that unnecessarily restricts lending. In a recent hearing in the Financial Institutions Subcommittee, I asked a credit union representative how many pages were in a standard loan application. He told me they don't measure the loans in pages anymore, but in pounds. That too can jeopardize the economic health of a community, and that's why Mr. Pittenger's bill is so important. A European-centric, overly complex definition of high volatility commercial real estate has dried up many acquisition, development, and construction loans. As a result of the Basel III agreement, many ADC loans are now subject to increased capital charges. This legislation would instill some common sense in this debate by exempting certain commercial loans from the HVCRE definition. H.R. 2148 includes safeguards to ensure that only loans with healthy loan-to-value qualify and requires borrowers to have skin in the game. This is a thoughtful approach to a problem that has impacted the development of communities across the nation. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this bill and ask my colleagues to join me in voting in favor of it today. I want to thank the gentleman again from North Carolina, for his outstanding work on the bill and his commitment to a more reasonable regulatory regime. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Right, the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
This bill has been carefully crafted, and we were aware of some of the legitimate concerns that the ranking member has raised, and we responded to those. Ms. Maloney's amendment has responded to those concerns. Our ranking member has expressed that she felt that the legislation might be too prescriptive and would create less clarity. But I would like to, of course, I think the ranking member now realizes that the protection that the regulators originally came up with, which was heightened capital requirements, are not altered in this bill. And some of those things, I think, go to the point, and I'm just delighted that we're able to have the ranking member's support on this. Let me give just a little bit of history as to how we're here. After the financial crisis, regulators wanted to require banks to hold more capital that offered these loans. But the result of that has been a lot of confusion. And so our bill expands the type of equity banks can use to meet their capital requirements, and it provides much needed clarity for when a loan is no longer needs to meet those tougher capital requirements, among other things. And I want to thank Mr. Pittenger. We worked on this, and my staff worked with his staff in trying to work with this. Mr. Pittenger worked with Ms. Maloney, and Ms. Maloney worked with Mr. Pittner, and we've satisfied some of the concerns of the ranking member, and I would say this is a bipartisan deal worthwhile, and I certainly recommend it. But I do want to be clear that the financial crisis saw a lot of banks go under. My state of Georgia led the nation in bank closures because of their heavy exposure in risky commercial real estate. There's no question about that. So moving to add more capital cushion to the riskiest of loans certainly makes a lot of sense. However, banking regulators, they wrote an overly broad and vague rule that failed to grasp the real-world problems in this area. So all our legislation does is provide the clarity of which types of loans should and should not be classified as HVCRE loans or high volatility commercial real estate loans. And the legislation does not eliminate the FDIC's ability to require banks to hold higher capital for these HVCRE loans. The language does nothing to the higher standard that was set in 2013 bill, and I'm very proud to work with it. It's good bipartisan effort, and I'm glad to see that my ranking member is joining us with this. Thank you very much. And that's a good bipartisan deal. Well done. Thank you, Mr. Pittenger.
Gentleman yield back.
Yes, I do, Mr.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to add my voice in support of this bill, but add a slightly different perspective than that which has been shared thus far. One of the roles I value most that I have the privilege to occupy is as co-chair of the Housing Task Force for the New Democrat Coalition. And we're working really hard to understand why the cost of shelter is rising relentlessly in so many cities around the country and trying to figure out what we might be able to do about it. But the basic cause is absolutely clear. Prices are rising because demand exceeds supply. And demand exceeds supply because we aren't building anywhere near enough housing to keep up with the population growth. Let me give some color to that. Last year's housing starts were 40% below the level of 10 years earlier, before the Great Recession, and at the same level of home construction that we had way back in 1994, 23 years ago, almost a quarter century. So even though a new home can be sold or rented for the highest prices in history, our construction activity last year didn't even place us in the top 10 years of all time. What is causing this supply shortage isn't clear. So we've been taking a deep look at the inputs. Interestingly enough, there are 4 inputs, and precisely 4, not 5, not 6, not 3. There are 4 inputs to housing construction: land, labor, lumber or building materials, and lending or financing. How elegant, all start with an L. And when we talk to banks about why they don't finance our multifamily construction, despite the high prices and strong markets, they've pointed to the difficulties created by HVCRE. So let's remember that even though it says commercial real estate, that includes multifamily housing. And that's a part of why we're having a housing shortage in this country, is the constriction in this particular area of financing. So I'm glad to see the regulators in this committee act to try and address this. It is my hope that our vote today can contribute a small amount toward more multifamily housing construction, which will lead to more affordable construction or more affordable housing. And I hope that we will continue to find ways in which we can make a difference, even if it is incremental, in trying to close this incredible structural deficit between the demand for housing and its supply. So I urge you to vote yes, especially in light of the amendment that is forthcoming. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition? We will pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
Hello.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Maloney, page 2, line 7, strike.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized on her amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I first would like to thank my good friend and colleague from the great state of North Carolina for his deep commitment and actually enthusiasm for this bill. It was his favorite thing to talk about on the floor. I also want to thank our ranking member, Maxine Waters, and all my Democratic colleagues that are supporting it and have worked on it. And I want to thank Chairman Henserling and his staff for their input and work on the amendment also. And the regulators and everybody else that we talked to about this amendment. I think this bill is a very important one, and I think that it addresses an extremely important issue, which is that the capital requirements for commercial real estate loans are overly complex for banks and unnecessarily punish certain types of commercial real estate loans. And when you punish commercial real estate loans, you are punishing the overall economy because more loans wouldn't get out to help the businesses grow. This issue has particularly affected community banks, which are active in the commercial real estate markets and which don't have massive teams of lawyers to sort out through complex capital rules. I would say the type of loans we're talking about are vanilla loans. These are the bread and butter of communities, just general commercial loans. It's not the complex credit default swaps, derivatives, other areas that got this country into the financial crisis, but really the backbone of supporting commercial activities in our country. The current capital rules punish commercial real estate loans that are considered high volatility by requiring banks to hold additional capital against them. They have to hold capital worth 150% for these high volatility loans as opposed to the normal 100% for other commercial real estate loans. These so-called high volatility commercial real estate loans are usually made so that a borrower can purchase vacant or undeveloped land which they can develop and build on later. But the capital rules for these so-called HVCRE loans were extremely complex and led to a great deal of confusion about which loans were considered high volatility and which were not. The regulators recognized years ago that their HVCRE rules were overly complicated and needed to be simplified, so there is broad consensus that this is a legitimate problem that needs to be fixed. And the regulators finally did propose a rule to simplify the treatment of high volatility commercial real estate loans just 2 weeks ago. And I believe it was probably in response to Mr. Pittenger's bill. This bill, which was introduced by my good friend Mr. Pittenger, aims to address the same issue as the regulators' proposed rule by simplifying the capital rules for commercial real estate loans. Both the bills and the regulators' proposed rule would simplify the capital rules by actually removing the so-called contribution capital requirement, which requires very complicated calculations. I would say they are crazy, complex calculations, some of the most difficult that I have ever had to read, and to project the value of the property years out into the future. So they completely threw this out, as Mr. Pittenger's bill did. But the bill and the regulators' proposed rule still differ on some of the other details. My amendment makes 3 changes that would better align the bill with the regulators' proposed rule, which is important to Democratic members. The first amendment adopts the primarily finances test that the regulators proposed in their rule, which is intended to address the confusion around multi-purpose loan facilities, which my friend Mr. Heck described in great detail and accurately, where only some of the loan proceeds go to finance the purchase of vacant or undeveloped land, and the rest of the loan proceeds are used for other activities. Under the current rule, many multi-purpose loan facilities that only finance a tiny amount of development activity are subject to the 150% capital surcharge for the entire loan facility. My amendment would clarify that only multi-purpose loan facilities that primarily finance development activities, which it would be, by one definition, over 50%, are subject to the 150% capital surcharge. This is the same approach that the regulators proposed in their rule as well, and should provide much-needed clarity for banks. Secondly, the amendment puts guardrails around loans for income-producing properties, which ensures that they can only get relief from the capital surcharge if they are actually producing sufficient income to cover debt service payments. In other words, if you're absolutely sure that they can carry this loan. This is also the same approach that the regulators took in their proposed rule, which considers loans on these income-producing properties to be permanent loans that are no longer subject to the 150% capital requirement. Finally, the amendment clarifies that the bill will apply, even if the regulators finalize their proposed rule. The regulators have technically proposed to change the terminology in the rule in a way that would make the bill null and void. So my amendment clarifies that the bill would apply to the new terminology that the regulators are proposing to use as well. This Congress has the right to write laws and pass them, even if the regulators decide that they are going to copy them and say you no longer need the bill. So this keeps this as an ironclad bill. So in summary, my amendment would align the bill with the regulator's proposed rule, which I think is very reasonable, and does not in any way compromise safety and soundness at all. I'd like to thank Mr. Pittenger, as well as the chairman and his staff, and the minority staff, and all my Democratic colleagues for working with me on this amendment. It provides much-needed clarity, regulatory relief. It's a good bill. I hope we can all get together, support it, and send it to the Senate for passage.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Is there any further debate on the amendment? The chair, for what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank Representative Maloney for continuing this dialogue and help move the bill through the committee. In the spirit of bipartisanship, I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Appreciate her work on this issue as we move forward. I look forward to working with her on this important matter and again express my deep gratitude for Congressman Scott and the Ranking Member Waters for their support. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Is there any further discussion or amendments on the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on ordering the bill as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hands and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 1585. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 1585 to amend the Securities Act of 1933.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, to offer an amendment in the nature of the substitute. Does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
The chair has been informed that copies of the amendment have already been distributed and are on the dais. The clerk will report.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Hill. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. I thank for bringing up H.R. 1585, the Fair Investment Opportunities for Professional Experts Act, which makes Reg D offerings and private placements more effective by broadening the definition of an accredited investor to account for educational or professional experience. I particularly want to thank the Arizona power couple of Schweikert and Sinema for working on this legislation in the past Congress and in this Congress, because it really does speak to a very important issue. Much of the money that's raised for business startups in our country is raised in a private offering pursuant to Reg D, and most Reg D money is raised pursuant to Rule 506. And while there are exemptions in 506 that permit sales of private securities to an unlimited number of accredited investors and 35 non-accredited investors, that exemption permission in 506 just typically is not used, because if there is any documentation error, or if one of those 35 people was not really an accredited investor, it places the entire offering at risk. And so typically, business management teams that are using the 506 rule under Reg D don't allow unaccredited or non-accredited investors. So this raises the cost and barriers to raising capital for our companies. And if you want to do a startup or expansion capital, this is the primary, as I said, methodology. The current definition focuses on the financial status of the investor, and as a result, typically only wealthy investors can participate in private offerings, barring the majority of Americans from what might be an attractive investment opportunity. H.R. 1585 expands the accredited investor definition, recognizing that the ability to participate in a private offering should not be solely based on an asset or income test, but that individuals who have sophistication should be able to participate. Many of our nation's accountants, stockbrokers, and venture capitalists may hold a money management license as a registered investor or have a Series 7 license and years of exceptional financial or educational expertise. yet they're not considered accredited investors under the current rules. This bill also revises these rules so that investors who have subject matter expertise or education and have a level of professional knowledge around a particular investment area may also be considered accredited investors, irrespective of whether or not they can meet the arbitrary asset or income test. And the design of this subject matter expertise and definition would be determined by the SEC. For example, Dr. Foster, our colleague on this committee, has frequently talked about people who are involved in innovation or expertise in starting a business, a technology business. They don't have a financial expertise. They are not an accredited investor by today's definition, but they have the knowledge, the technology knowledge, the management knowledge, the particular industry capability to be, in fact, a subject matter expert. And therefore, this would give them the opportunity to participate in a private offering around which they had superior knowledge. So, Mr. Chairman, this is a bill that is a matter of basic fairness. I've been involved in this market for over 20 years, and I can't tell you all the number of people who should have been treated as an accredited investor on transactions and money raised for small business expansion or innovation that should have had the opportunity to invest as an accredited investor, but were prohibited by our very narrow definition. Expanding the accredited investor definition will not only increase investment opportunities for more Americans, it will help grow our economy by enhancing the ability of small and emerging companies to raise capital, particularly those who give the majority of net new jobs are created from companies less than 5 years old. The ability of these companies to raise capital in the private markets is critical to our economic well-being. I'm proud to support this bill. I thank my colleagues, Mr. Schweikert, Ms. Sinema, for their support, and I yield back the balance of my time. I encourage a yes vote.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly support this bill, and I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor, along with Mr. Schweikert and Mr. Hill. This bill modernizes the outdated rules by who qualifies as an accredited investor. I would like to be associated with the statement of Mr. Hill. I have a long statement, which in the interest of time, I would ask permission to place into the record as if I read it or as if I spoke it. And I think it's a modernization bill, and I urge all of my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purposes? Gentleman from California seek recognition.
I rise to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I support this bill because it doesn't just expand, but also in one important area would lead to a contraction of the definition of accredited investor, and I think makes that definition better. Not only does it do the things the gentleman pointed out, but it provides that the annual income and net worth definitions of accredited investor will be codified and then adjusted every 5 years for inflation. Otherwise, even with modest inflation, by the end of this century, everybody will be an accredited investor, or at least half the households in the country. Seeing that I have some additional time, I would want to comment on some of the other legislation and commend that to your attention. The first is HR 3973, the Market Data Protection Act. I am the Democratic co-sponsor. Want to commend the sponsor, Warren Davidson, for introducing this legislation. It requires that we have risk controls to make sure we don't see hacking of sensitive information at the SEC and at FINRA, and it directs the operator of the Consolidated Audit Trail, the CAT, to develop risk controls to protect data and not accept any sensitive data until it has the proper risk controls developed in coordination with the SEC in light of recent disclosures of confidential information, clearly a necessary bill. In addition, I want to comment on HR 3971, which I introduced as chief co-sponsor with Claudia Tenney. This bill is important because it focuses on those modestly sized institutions that are willing to retain the mortgage for 3 years on their own book. 100% skin in the game. If they determine that that is a borrower who's going to pay the loan and will pay their property taxes themselves, pay their insurance themselves, they can choose to do that without having an impound account. And to me, the impound account, you can argue both ways. I prefer to pay my own property taxes rather than have the bank do it. But when you have a moderate institution, if you're going to require them to have an impound account and they are not set up to do it, then they'll sell the mortgage, which means they won't have skin in the game. And having community institutions who know their neighborhoods and know their borrowers making these for their own account, I think is a better system to assure that loans are made that borrowers can afford to repay. Finally, as to H.R. 477, I'll be a reluctant no. The SEC has already issued a no-action letter that achieves the objectives of this legislation, but has 6 caveats or requirements. This bill only codifies 2 of them, and I think that I'd be very happy to codify the SEC no-action letter, but feel that most, if not all, of the 6 restrictions put in by the SEC are necessary. So I thank the chairman for the opportunity to address all this legislation. I may be speaking out of order, but we're taking the bills out of order, and I'm pleased that you've given me the opportunity to address these bills briefly before we vote on them, or at least toward the end of this day, and we'll be voting on them tomorrow morning. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that, and I certainly won't take my full 5 minutes, but I just wanted to weigh in my support for the current piece of legislation. I absolutely agree with the objectives. Number one, what I continue to hear from Hoosiers back home is their strong desire to see this body continue to make determinations that are going to affect them in material ways. And so I'm excited that we are codifying something that right now has just been put forth by a regulatory body. More and more, I hear Hoosiers back home talk about their desire to see the legislative process work, desire to see elected officials making decisions on their behalf rather than relegating those decisions to the executive branch. And so I'm excited to see that part. In addition to that, one aspect I'm particularly excited about in this current bill is adding expert professionals so that they can also be accredited. I think that we've heard significant testimony in this committee, time and time again, about how the simple rules put forth beforehand might exclude an extremely knowledgeable, extremely experienced individual in the ways of finance, but who might not have met the clear binary resource tests necessary to become an accredited investor. And so I'm excited that that's being added to it so we can continue to see more and more opportunities for more and more people all the way across this country to participate in offerings. I want to see them have more control over their financial future by enabling them to have more investment options. And certainly, as we've seen the decline in the number of public companies, thus a decline in the investment opportunities and options available to investors, I'm glad to see we're expanding the number of opportunities in this space specifically. And so I'm certainly in support of the legislation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Would you yield to the chairman?
I will indeed yield to the chairman.
I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. I, too, want to thank the gentleman from Arkansas, not just for his leadership on this issue, but his great leadership on this committee. Also thank the 2 members from Arizona for what they have done on this bill as well. This is important for small companies, and frankly, it's important to people in the investment community who, again, might not necessarily meet the strict net worth or income test, but yet have great expertise in the area of investment, maybe even more so than those who have higher net worth. And so I think this actually helps codify the original intent of the accredited investor statute, and so I think it's going to be, again, helpful to investors, helpful to emerging companies to open up even more capital opportunities for them, and I would urge all members to adopt it. I thank the gentleman from Indiana. I assume he yields back his time.
I do yield back.
He yields back his time. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentlelady from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Henserling, and I want to thank my colleague from Arizona, Congressman Schweikert, Congressman Hill, and Congresswoman Maloney for partnering together on this legislation to expand the definition of accredited investor. This is a designation that permits a person to invest in unregistered securities offerings. We together should find ways for knowledgeable professionals who understand private offerings to more directly participate in the market. Robust investor participation ensures that Arizona small businesses have the capital they need to hire and grow. And in 2015, the SEC issued recommendations in a staff report to revise the criteria that define an accredited investor to give qualified Americans the opportunity to invest in unregistered securities offerings. So our bipartisan bill adopts many of the SEC's recommendations. It defines accredited investor as persons meeting the SEC's current income or net worth requirement, any broker or an investment advisor registered by the SEC or FINRA, and any person that the SEC determines by regulation to have the necessary education and job experience as verified by FINRA. I support allowing registered brokers and investment advisors to invest in unregistered securities offerings because they're knowledgeable professionals who understand private offerings. It also is just common sense that a person with expertise in a subject related to a particular investment should be able to invest. For example, doctors should be able to invest in medical device companies. So this bill is a common sense bill that ensures that Arizona businesses have the capital they need to thrive, and I want to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their support of this legislation. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? Is there any further discussion or amendment? Seeing none, the question now occurs on adoption of the substitute amendment offered by the gentleman from Arkansas. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion, for what purpose the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Yes, the yeas and nays, Mr. Chairman.
The bill, a recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. There's a sufficient number having raised their hands. A recorded vote is so ordered. Pursuant to subsection C5, Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1645. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 1645 to amend the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Sinema, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Henserling and Ranking Member Waters. And I want to start by thanking Congressman Trey Hollingsworth of Indiana for working with me on this legislation to cut red tape for innovative emerging growth companies, known as EGCs, that are on the cutting edge of scientific and medical research. I'm so proud that Arizona is home to a growing number of emerging innovative companies. Institutions like Arizona State University have done a great job of encouraging entrepreneurs to take risks on good ideas, supporting job creation, and diversifying Arizona's economy. And as part of our Kirsten Means Business Initiative back home, I've heard from companies across our state about how red tape is holding businesses back from growing the economy and creating jobs. Emerging growth biopharmaceutical companies in Arizona are conducting research right now that could cure deadly diseases, improve quality of life, and lower healthcare costs for millions of Americans. While current law exempts EGCs from certain regulatory requirements for 5 years after their initial public offering, we believe this is not enough. One exempted requirement is Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404B, which requires public companies to obtain an external audit on the effectiveness of their internal controls for financial reporting. This reporting requirement is costly and unnecessary because management is still required to assess internal controls, and these EGCs, by definition, have limited public exposure. And that's why we've introduced H.R. 1645, the Fostering Innovation Act. This narrow bipartisan fix extends the Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404B exemption for an additional 5 years for a small subset of EGCs with an annual average revenue of less than $50 million and less than $700 million in public float. This will enable EGCs to use valuable resources to remain competitive, stable, and ultimately successful without undermining investor protections. In the biopharma market, these reduced regulatory costs mean greater competition and potentially lower drug prices for consumers. Importantly, nothing in this bill prevents an external audit if a company or the majority of its shareholders determines that an audit is beneficial. Costly regulation shouldn't stand in the way of success for companies working on the cutting edge of scientific and medical research. The Fostering Innovation Act is a narrowly tailored, bipartisan solution that ensures Arizona businesses have the opportunity to succeed. This committee and the full House approved this legislation in the last Congress, so I would encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support the Fostering Innovation Act this year. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too wanted to rise in support of this legislation and appreciate all of the hard work and effort that Representative Sinema has put together on behalf of this piece of legislation. I absolutely concur with her comments in speaking about how we can deliver more dollars to the underlying cures research that so many of these companies are engaging in instead of more of their dollars going to compliance. I want more of these researchers, more of these companies focused on how they can deliver better solutions to enable Americans to live better lives than simply focused on more duplicative paperwork that seems unnecessary given the relative size of their business. This fix is truly very narrow and builds on the success that was already in place without any issues with regard to investor disclosures or other investor requirements. We have to make sure that we continue to support our small businesses, especially those small businesses that require tremendous capital in order to get their cures through the regulatory process and out to benefiting the American people. And so this bill very much solves that problem, very much continues the investor protections necessary, and still enables these companies to be able to elect, should it be in their best interest, should it be in their investors' best interest, to still undergo a 404B audit to do that. And so I stand in strong support of the legislation, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Well, the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. H.R. 1645 would amend the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, SOX, to exempt emerging growth companies for up to a decade from the Section 404B audit requirements if they are below certain revenue and public float thresholds. We must be mindful that Sarbanes-Oxley was enacted in the wake of Enron's collapse to protect investors by increasing the accuracy and transparency of financial reporting by public companies. Section 404B of SOX requires a public company's external auditor to independently evaluate and verify the management's assertions about the effectiveness of the company's internal controls over financial reporting. The Dodd-Frank Act currently exempts approximately 60% of public companies from the Section 404B auditor review. Moreover, the 2012 Jobs Act created an additional 5-year exemption for companies that go public with less than $1 billion in annual revenues, which today accounts for 85% of newly public companies. Unfortunately, exemptions from SOX audit requirements have likely increased the risk of investing in smaller companies. In 2013, the GAO found that companies that do not have an audit of financial reporting controls have a significantly higher likelihood of issuing a restatement of their financial statements. To be clear, restatements are devastating to a public company's reputation and erode investor confidence in our capital markets. On the other hand, auditor evaluations of financial reporting provide substantial benefits to investors and public companies by promoting strong internal controls, fostering investor confidence, and facilitating fraud prevention. That is why academics, investor advocacy groups, and even SEC officials have opposed expanding SOX 404B exemptions. I too have serious concerns with the bill that allows companies to have weak internal controls and makes it harder for investors to gain access to information they rely on in determining the value of their company. For these reasons, I oppose H.R. 1645, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Congresswoman Sinema, Congressman Hollingsworth for their important work on this. This is a very important step. Following some of the accounting scandals we all remember back in the 90s and early 2000s, Sarbanes-Oxley Act was signed into law. Certainly the intention at the time was to protect investors by setting new requirements for public company boards, management, and their accounting firms. Many of us weren't in Congress when that was signed into law, but the feedback I've received since is that it was not enough was done to consider the regulatory burden that was placed on smaller companies at that time. In fact, a 2008 report from the Heritage Foundation found that while the ESC initially estimated the cost of complying with Section 404 of Sarbanes-Oxley to be $1.24 billion in the aggregate, multiple other studies have projected the actual cost to be $35 billion just in compliance. It also notes companies with smaller market capitalizations in the range from 75 to 700 million are disproportionately impacted. Compliance with 404B is 0.46% of these smaller companies' revenue. This is a staggering amount of money for complying with just one provision of one law. This is part of the reason why that this was addressed in the Bipartisan Jobs Act, but I also know there is more that we need to do on this, and it's why I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the Fostering Innovations Act. Fostering Innovations Act extends the exemption to comply with Section 404B of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act for emerging growth companies that will otherwise lose their exempt status at the end of the 5-year period that applies under current law. This makes sense. Appreciate the bipartisan work that's happened on this bill, and would yield to the gentleman from Indiana.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I just wanted to make a few points, and certainly I profoundly respect the ranking member's deep desire to ensure that investors have the proper protections that they feel that they need. I think where we might differ is in understanding who should be making that decisions, and truly, if it's in the company's best interest and in the investor's best interest to have a 404B audit, nothing in this legislation prevents investors from demanding of their companies that they undergo a 404B audit. So truly, if there is a difference between the cost of equity capital that's being raised by these very small companies through a 404B audit or not having a 404B audit, then that's a business decision for those small companies to make. And I don't think it's the place of Washington to continue to put onerous demands, onerous and duplicative regulatory demands on these very small companies. And again, I would push back slightly against the example that was used in Enron, which was one of the country's largest companies, certainly wouldn't have fallen under this exemption, and certainly wouldn't have fallen under the original exemption either. And still yet, even with all of the internal controls audits, even with all of the external auditors, it still underwent all of the financial distress that was caused by investors, by employees, and the many partners of Enron at the time. And so I think that it should be up to the companies, these small companies, to make the decision as to whether they want to go undertake the 404B audit or not, based on the cost of that equity capital that they would be raising in public markets so that they can push these cures through the regulatory process and get them out to helping everyday Americans. And so with that, I'll yield back to the gentleman from Illinois.
And if the gentleman from Illinois will yield to the chair. Thank you. I appreciate it. I, too, want to lend my support to this. And as has been pointed out, the Section 404B is an issue. I'm glad that this has been tackled. I congratulate work of Mr. Hollingsworth and Ms. Sinema on this, and appreciate the bipartisan nature of this. So with that, I yield back to the gentleman from Illinois.
I yield back as well.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentlelady from New York. For what purpose? The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I think this bill is a sensible compromise that provides narrowly targeted relief to only the companies that truly need it. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Ms. Sinema, and all that worked with her for working so hard on it and putting together a really thoughtful approach. I opposed a previous version of this bill because I thought it was far too broad. This requirement under this bill, known as the 404B requirement, has been proven to be effective. A 2013 GAO report found that 404B generally has a positive impact on investor confidence in the quality of financial reports. But we also have to acknowledge that this requirement, while useful, is also expensive and might not be necessary for a small subset of companies whose business model is very unique. Biotech companies in particular raise money from investors and then initially funnel most of that money into research and development. Researching a new drug and getting FDA approval is a very, very long process. As a result, some biotech companies don't start producing revenues for many years, much, much longer than other companies. This bill would provide targeted relief for only these kinds of companies, companies that have a large market cap but still don't have sufficient revenues to pay for compliance with the 404B rule. This bill is narrow because it only provides temporary relief to companies that are exiting their 5-year period as an emerging growth company and who still have annual revenues of under $50 million. This revenue ceiling is extremely important. It essentially makes companies prove they can't afford the 404B requirement. Once a company's revenues exceed $50 million, then they lose the relief because at that point they can afford for the compliance. But the most relief that companies could get under this bill is 5 additional years after their emerging growth period ends. So I think this is a very good compromise. It successfully limits the relief to only the companies that need it because of their unique business model and the length of their FDA approval process. And I just want to make it clear that this bill does not provide any companies with an exemption from the requirement to file audited financial statements. That is still a requirement that under no circumstances does this bill allow a company to evade this critical investor protection. I really applaud everyone that was involved with it for a very thoughtful compromise. I support it, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I want to thank my colleagues, Representative Hollingsworth and Representative Sinema, for their hard work on this bill. As you all know, the Fostering Innovation Act will extend the temporary exemption on auditor attestations for former emerging growth companies that maintain a public float below $700 million of stock and have average annual revenues below $50 million. The $50 million figure is very important because it narrows the scope of the bill to pre-revenue companies with unique business models such as clinical stage biotechnology companies. One such company, Gliomimetrics, testified before this committee 2 years ago about its research into treatments to enhance the ability of chemotherapy to kill cancer cells. And when these pre-revenue companies are forced to spend dollars on expensive auditing requirements, these funds are diverted from potentially life-saving research. This legislation will impact a very narrow range of companies, but we should be mindful that they're among the most impactful on innovation and the ability to save lives. That's what attracted me to this bill, and that's why I want to encourage all my colleagues to support it. And I want to thank the chairman for including me on this legislative markup. And I will yield the time to the gentleman from Indiana if he still wants any more time. You're good. I'll yield the balance of my time back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any more discussion? Seeing none, if there's no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill reported favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay. And in the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I request the yeas and nays.
The recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hands and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the Committee on Rules, vote on this question is postponed. Now pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 2201. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 2201 to
Without
amend the
objection, the bill
Securities-
is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for bringing the Micro Offering Safe Harbor Act up for consideration in this 115th Congress. While government doesn't create jobs, with the help of the President, Congress can set federal policies that establish a pro-worker and pro-business environment that lifts people out of poverty, helps families, and allows Americans to realize their greatest dreams. Access to capital remains one of the biggest challenges small businesses continue to face today. American businessmen and women can't get the loans they need to start a new enterprise or grow an existing one. Additionally, if a firm would like to publicly sell stock to raise money, it must register with the Securities and Exchange Commission, which costs $2.5 million on average, an amount most small businesses simply can't afford. Small business creates over 50% of the new jobs on an annual basis in this country. They encourage competition and foster innovation. In fact, many of today's small businesses will be tomorrow's big businesses. Just think of all the great business in this country that started with a dream in a garage: Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Disney, Harley-Davidson, and Minnesota's own Medtronic. We want to empower entrepreneurs to dream, innovate, and create jobs that grow our economy and opportunity for everyone. That's why we introduced the Micro Lending Safe Harbor Act with a number of colleagues on this committee, to make it easier for entrepreneurs and small businesses to raise money from family, friends, and their personal network without running afoul of the vague and undefined private offering safe harbor provisions in the Securities Act of 1933. We are not creating new law. I emphasize that. We are not creating new law. The Micro Offering Safe Harbor Act helps bring clarity and enhances existing law so that job creators can easily raise capital within the confines of an easy-to-understand provision without the help of an expensive expert. This legislation, which incorporates the suggestions made by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle during a legislative hearing last Congress, requires 3 specific criteria to be met simultaneously in order to trigger a safe harbor exemption for a security offering, instead of just one or more. Number 1, each purchaser has a substantive pre-existing relationship with an owner. Number 2, there are no more than 35 purchasers of securities from the issuer that are sold in reliance on the exemption during the 12-month period. And number 3, the aggregate amount of all securities sold by the issuers does not exceed $500,000 during the 12-month proceeding. The bill also exempts any of the aforementioned security offerings from blue sky laws while maintaining, and again I emphasize, while maintaining anti-fraud laws and penalties at the federal and state level. The existing federal and state laws will continue to protect Americans from criminals who may try to swindle them out of their hard-earned money. Unfortunately, there are 3 million fewer small businesses loans made annually today than there were before the 2008 financial crisis. While banks and credit unions work to offer the funding that small business needs to grow and thrive, the Micro Offering Safe Harbor Act enables them to confidently find alternative ways of raising capital without having to pay for costly securities experts and without fear of lawsuits if they operate within these easy-to-understand parameters. The Micro Offering Safe Harbor Act is supported by the National Small Business Association, the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and Engine, the voice of startups in government. This clarification of existing law is a next-generation tool for capital formation. The time has come for Congress to come together and help small businesses help themselves by making this important update and improvement to the Securities Act of 1933. Again, I want to thank the chairman for calling this markup, and I hope that giving the opportunity for small business to grow and succeed, as the Micro Offering Safe Harbor Act seeks to do, is something that leaders in both parties can champion. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
H.R. 2201 would create yet another exemption from the public offering. requirements of our federal and state securities laws, an exemption which I do not believe is warranted and may actually harm investors and the integrity of our markets. Specifically, the bill would provide an exemption for offerings where each investor has a substantive pre-existing relationship with the company. There are 35 or fewer purchases of the offered securities, and the aggregate amount sold in a year is not more than $500,000. Despite the similarity of these provisions to some restrictions currently imposed on unregistered securities offerings, H.R. 2201 omits several critical investor protections that are characteristic of the existing exemptions. For example, the bill has no restriction on resale, making the initial purchaser limit illusory, as purchasers could immediately resell the securities to countless others in secondary market transactions. In the past, failure to restrict the sale of unregistered securities has exposed secondary investors to fraudulent pump and dump schemes. Additionally, the bill fails to take into account the numerous other exemptions we have for small dollar offerings, including under Regulation D, Regulation A, and crowdfunding rules. Given these existing exemptions, which provide ample opportunity for companies to raise capital while also protecting investors, I fail to see the need for H.R. 2201. The bill would simply create a loophole in the law for companies to secretly conduct public offerings and possibly scams. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing H.R. 2201, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purposes, gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this because I actually disagree with our ranking member on how this legislation actually will impact our economy. We know that small, innovative entrepreneurs grow our economy. That's where a majority of job creation is. It's not the big headlines in the newspaper of 200 jobs added at widget company A. It's those small innovators that are there adding 1 or 2 or 3 people. They're getting an investor to put in some reasonably sized dollars, but not the kind of institutional dollars that are often invested by major organizations. You know, this just makes sense. And having witnessed this firsthand, seeing people that I know, friends and family, who have been involved and engaged in these types of offerings, having a reasonable expectation of the capabilities of your brother-in-law or your aunt or somebody who is known to you since high school or college, that you can look at them and say, you know what, you've built a better mousetrap. You've actually figured something out here. And limiting that in both exposure on dollar amounts as well as exposure on who all can invest, the number of total investors, this really is designed to help Main Street, not Wall Street. Wall Street's doing just fine. This is helping Main Street. And guess what? Here's the cool secret about this. Those little companies become big companies. Medtronic, as my friend from Minnesota was talking about, started out in a garage. It now has hectares of land that are devoted to research and office buildings and all those things. It's that kind of engine of our economy that has separated us from the rest of the world. Why we would not want to encourage that, I don't understand. And you know, this I believe really truly is a common sense step. It is a positive step, and I just want to congratulate my friend and colleague from Minnesota on his work with that. And with that, Mr. Chairman,
would you yield to the chairman?
I'm happy to do so.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Again, I want to thank the leadership of the gentleman from Minnesota. This is one more very important bill trying to unlock capital for our Small businesses are startups. We know for the last 8 years, we've seen economic growth stagnate at roughly 1.5% to 2% of GDP when the historic norms are 3 to 3.5%. That's left a whole lot of families behind. Entrepreneurship has been at a generational low, and one of the reasons is lack of access to capital. And so we know that these small businesses, as my friend from Michigan has indicated, they're the ones who become big businesses. And we know that often they have to start out with, very early stage seed capital from basically their electronic Rolodex, and it's friends, it's families, it's people they know, who they see at the Chamber of Commerce. And we've got to help jumpstart this. I mean, America has fallen behind. Now, fortunately, we're starting to see some growth in the economy. We'll certainly see a whole lot more with fundamental tax reform, but this is one important step we can take. And it's important that we actually codify the definition of what a non-public offering actually means, what a private placement is. And so I applaud the gentleman from Minnesota, and I think this is an important bill, and I urge members on both sides of the aisle to support it. I yield back to the gentleman from Michigan.
And I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Minnesota the remaining time.
Thank you to both of you for your comments. I'm extremely disappointed in my colleague from California. All the changes we made to this bill were based on things that she brought up in the last Congress. We are not creating a new exemption. We are simply clarifying the term private offering from the 1933 Act, and we have left in place all state and federal anti-fraud laws. So again, we've addressed all the concerns. It seems to be a moving target, and I hope the colleague from California will take a closer look at what we did to help her accept this bill.
Time of the gentleman from Michigan has expired. For what purpose? Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would truly like to thank my colleague from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, for his valiant efforts to help entrepreneurs across America. This necessary piece of legislation will help small businesses to raise the capital needed to provide growth and economic success for their businesses. Small businesses are at the heart of our economy, providing over half of the jobs in the United States. Unfortunately, small businesses have been hurt by unnecessary regulations, causing burdensome paperwork, wasting resources that could be used to further the business's economic growth. These regulations also leave small businesses vulnerable to litigation, regardless of their best efforts to comply with the Securities Act, due to its unclear provisions regarding non-public offerings. This legislation clarifies the Securities Act by creating three safe harbor exemptions for non-public offerings in order for small businesses to operate without the constant concern of violating the Securities Act. Small businesses will not be in violation of the Securities Act when doing a non-public security offering if each investor has a pre-existing relationship with an owner, there are 35 or less investors, and the amount invested does not exceed $500,000. This legislation reduces the onerous regulations placed on our country's small businesses, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bill, as I will. Again, I congratulate Mr. Emmert on his work, and may I say to you, Mr. Emmert, your mother, an entrepreneur in her own right, with her lawn statue business, would be very proud of you today. I yield back the balance of my time to the
gentleman. Would the gentleman yield?
I yield to the gentleman at this time.
Thank you. I also want to congratulate Congressman Emmer for his work on this. It is so important for us to encourage these small businesses, and this has been something that needs to be addressed. The clarifying, really, of the existing law, which does not adequately define public offerings. Legislation, as Congressman Emmer said, also has very strong safeguards to prevent bad actors from participating in micro offerings. This committee has heard time and time again that small business across the country is the engine for job growth and are having trouble accessing the capital that they need to grow. It's especially troubling that our securities laws are contributing to confusion for issuers and investors. We should not permit regulatory uncertainty to be an impediment to capital formation, which is currently happening. So again, thank you, Congressman Emmer. I'm proudly supporting this and encourage my colleagues to support it as well. Yield back the balance. Yield back to the gentleman from North Carolina.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to underscore the importance of the legislation offered by the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer. As I've traveled through my district back in Colorado, I've often been dismayed by the increasing number of storefronts that were once thriving businesses with for sale or for lease signs that are now out in front. Small businesses are essential to job creation and innovation, but they've been so hamstrung by the burden of compliance with regulations intended for large public companies that their ability to be able to create jobs and to be able to innovate has been stifled. The Micro Offering Safe Harbor Act will exempt certain micro offerings from the registration requirements of the Securities Acts of 1933, thereby removing obstacles to obtaining funding in the capital markets for Main Street businesses. As the chairman has often noted, it's hard for capitalism to work without capital. This legislation tackles that problem and creates opportunities for hardworking small businesses to be able to go public, to raise initial early-stage seed capital. Growth is often contingent on capital, and without investment, it is easy for businesses to falter. By defining the non-public offering exemption under the Securities Act, this bill will provide small businesses with much-needed clarity and a renewed confidence in what the proper procedure is for non-public offerings that doesn't violate the law. Removing this confusion will provide small businesses with the certainty and will allow them to be able to focus their resources on growth rather than compliance. For this reason, I do support this measure. Would like to encourage all of our colleagues to be able to do the same. And once again, I'd like to commend Mr. Emmer for introducing this legislation to alleviate burdensome compliance environment that's imposed on small businesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? If there is no other further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill reported favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3758. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3758 to provide immunity from suit for certain individuals who disclose
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Sinema, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hensterling, and thank you to Congressman Poliquin of Maine for working with me on this bipartisan solution to protect seniors from financial fraud and abuse. Mr. Chairman, 1 in 5 American seniors will be a target of financial abuse, and seniors lose an estimated $2.9 billion a year to financial exploitation. America's financial institutions are in a unique position to detect and identify the suspicious patterns of activity that often accompany financial abuse. But current laws lack the necessary flexibility to enable companies to report suspicious behavior to law enforcement. Because of this, abuse may go unreported and unpunished. And that's why we've introduced H.R. 3758, the Senior Safe Act. Our bill helps individuals and financial institutions safely communicate instances of financial fraud involving seniors to the appropriate law enforcement authority. It creates incentives for firms to train their employees to identify and stop financial fraud of seniors. It shields advisors and firms that responsibly disclose instances of suspected financial fraud from legal liability. Mr. Chairman, just last week, this committee heard from the former CEO of Equifax, Richard Smith, about the data breach that exposed the personal information of over 145 million Americans. Those who mishandle our private data and potentially violate our laws must be held accountable. We must also ensure that we do all we can to minimize the damage caused by cyber attacks and financial fraud. As a result of the Equifax data breach, millions of American seniors are now more vulnerable to financial abuse. It's all but certain that we will see increased attempts of financial fraud and identity theft. The Senior Safe Act is an important and responsible step to protecting those at risk by ensuring financial institutions can identify fraud, report it, and stop abuse of the elderly. This bipartisan common sense solution is important now more than ever. And I want to thank members on both sides of the aisle for their work as we protect seniors and end financial exploitation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maine seek recognition?
Strike the last word, please.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate very much you bringing this very important bill before our committee, and I am thrilled to work with Representative Sinema from Arizona. This is a great example, Mr. Chairman, of bipartisan work in trying to help our seniors. You know, Mr. Chairman, is that my mom and dad are quite senior now, 89 and 87. I love them to death, and I'm very involved in their lives, and I worry about them. I worry about them being taken advantage of, and I think all of us who have aging parents worry about this. And, you know, one thing about Maine, a lot of people don't know it, it has the oldest average age in the country. Yeah, it's not Arizona, it's not Florida, it's Maine, Mr. Chairman, and we have more and more seniors who are being, because of their age, put in very vulnerable situations. And as Ms. Sinema just said, on average, sir, about $2.9 billion of fraud is committed against our seniors. And this is something that we can all address, we can all agree on. It needs to be fixed if any way we can, and Congress certainly has an opportunity right here and right now, Mr. Chairman, to work on this. I'd like to salute Judith Shaw, who's the Maine Securities Administration up in Augusta, sir, who has put together a program in the state of Maine specifically designed to help stop fraud before it happens and imposed upon our seniors. And also, our senior senator in the state of Maine, not a senior, but the senior member of our delegation, sir, Senator Susan Collins, who has done great work in leading the effort to protect our seniors over on the Senate side. But here on the House side, the Senior Safe Act is a great Maine common sense bill. And as an example of how this works, if you have a senior showing up at their local community bank or credit union, and they want to withdraw the entire balance of their savings account and wire it somewhere to Italy because they heard from their granddaughter is in trouble and can't get home and don't want to tell their parents, so please, Nana, help us out. It would be great if that bank teller or someone that's selling insurance to our seniors or someone that's planning for their retirement, helping to plan for their retirement, are able to speak up, Mr. Chairman, and say, we sense something is really wrong here, and we want to notify the authorities and not worry about liability in doing so we can protect our seniors and speak up before the fraud happens. And that's exactly what this bill does. I'd encourage everybody, Republicans and Democrats, to join Ms. Sinema and myself, a Republican and a Democrat from two different parts of the country, to do something that is very good for our seniors and help protect our precious seniors. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes the ranking members seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, H.R. 3758 would provide employees at financial institutions immunity when voluntarily disclosing the possible financial abuse of elders to state and federal regulators, law enforcement agencies, and adult protective services agencies. Financial exploitation of our elders is a serious problem. According to one study highlighted by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, seniors lose as much as $36.5 billion each year to financial abuse. This staggering estimate includes nearly $17 billion lost as a result of financial exploitation, nearly $13 billion lost annually to criminal fraud, such as identity theft, and nearly $7 billion lost through caregiver abuse involving deceit or theft enabled by a trusting relationship. Although our federal and state regulators have taken considerable steps to encourage the identification and disclosure of such abuse, industry continues to argue that these steps haven't provided enough legal certainty. Ms. Sinema's bill provides that certainty once and for all. Ms. Sinema's bill also instructs financial institutions on how to provide training to identify and disclose suspected elder abuse to government officials and law enforcement authorities. While some have called for such disclosures to be mandatory and for lowering the age threshold for such disclosures from 65 to 60 to cover a greater number of vulnerable seniors, I think this bill is a good first step. As Gandhi famously said, quote, "The true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members, quote unquote. I couldn't agree more, and in keeping with that spirit, I plan to support this legislation. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly don't intend to utilize this whole 5 minutes, but I want to lend my voice in saying that this is a very positive thing. Having seniors as well, and I know my colleague from Maine was talking about his much cherished parents and that scenario of how we need to protect our seniors. Look, we've all gotten the email from the Nigerian prince needing help. We've all gotten that email from a nephew or a niece stuck in Europe after they've been robbed. Most of us are tuned in enough that we go, you know what, this isn't on the up and up. And the ability to put additional safeguards in place, I think is just commendable. And the fact that only 1 in 44 cases of financial abuse is ever reported, according to the National Adult Protective Services Association, is stunning, really. And having served as executor of estates and having had elderly parents as well, there's a certain responsibility that we have as a society. And I think that this is a very positive step. I know FINRA's board has authorized a proposed rule to help protect senior investors as well by trying to get contact information of trusted persons for customers' accounts. And this proposal allows firms to freeze senior investors' accounts when there's a reasonable belief in financial fraud. And I think this is well crafted. This is right on target, and kudos to my colleagues for acting in a bipartisan fashion to take care of this. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy.
Yeah, if you would yield to the chairman.
To do so.
I want to thank the gentleman from Maine, the gentlelady from Arizona. This is a very important piece of legislation for our seniors. It's one that's a little personal to me. My mother's 85. I help her with her finances. I know for a fact that there have been a number of fraudsters who have tried to take advantage of her, and I can only imagine this goes on around the entire nation. I hear from my constituents as well. So this is a common sense protection. I'm glad that we could move it out on a bipartisan basis. And again, thank the gentlelady from Arizona, the gentleman from Maine for this very important piece of legislation. I yield back to the gentleman from Michigan.
And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill reported favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it, and the ayes have it. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I request the yeas and nays.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands. A recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3948. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3948 to prohibit the Securities and Exchange Commission from compelling a person to produce or furnish trading sources code or similar intellectual property to the commission.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first thank Mr. Scott for working across the aisle once again to address an issue that was highlighted earlier this year in the CFTC reauthorization. It's one of those moments where we see an American problem, and it's not a Republican or Democrat, red or blue problem. It's two people working together to fix an issue that we see, and I want to thank Mr. Scott for his partnership. So in December of 2015, the CFTC issued a proposed rule known as Reg AT that would have taken the unprecedented step of requiring market participants engaged in algorithmic trading to maintain a source code repository and make it available for inspection by the CFTC or the Department of Justice without a subpoena. Again, that's an affront to some basic concepts that we have in jurisprudence, and especially when the government wants to seize or take information. So Mr. Scott and I joined forces and brought forward an amendment that passed the House by voice vote on January 12th, and it required the CFTC to issue a subpoena before compelling the production of algorithmic trading source codes and similar intellectual property. Now, as most issues that take place in this body, it passed, and it again sits and waits for action in the Senate. The recent cyber attacks at Equifax, the SEC and the NSA show that all organizations are vulnerable to security risks, and the incidents that have taken place are a timely reminder that there is significant risk in this era of the digital age. So given this reality, it's important for government agencies such as the SEC to rethink what they collect, how they collect it, how it's stored, and what they do with it long term. So we want to do with the SEC what we did with the CFTC, making sure that we have a subpoena before any information is garnered or accumulated. And again, we think this is just the right course forward when government wants information, but also we need to make sure that this information is securely stored, because the consequences of a breach, as we're all aware, can be devastating for individuals, for markets, and for companies. So I want to thank the gentleman, Mr. Scott, for his participation and effort in making this a bipartisan bill. With that and a few beads of sweat on my head, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, let me just state how this sort of came about, and I really appreciate this opportunity working with Mr. Duffy and his staff and my staff got together. Given my membership on both the House Financial Services Committee, the House Agriculture Committee, and as the ranking member of the Commodities Exchange, Derivatives, and Swaps Committee, I'm sort of in a unique position to comment on regulating this source code. Earlier last year, through the Reg AT rulemaking with the CFTC, which comes under my jurisdiction as ranking member on the Ag Committee, we saw regulators trying to unnecessarily get their hands on source code without a subpoena. Well, that raised great cause for concern for me. And so I chatted with Mr. Duffy. My staff went to work, his staff, and we wrote language in this bill so that only the source code and related research would require a subpoena before you can compel trading companies like hedge funds to produce source code. Now, let me take just a moment in case to make sure everybody understands what the source code is and why it requires this. The source code is that computer output that makes what is called algorithms. And those algorithms enable programs to be executed at an extraordinarily rapid speed, making for greater efficiency. And it is what I refer to as the secret sauce for our traders who are dealing in mutual funds. And that's why requiring the subpoena before the SEC can get its hands on high-frequency traders' source code that some people think that that it may be like a handcuff that we're trying to put on the regulators. But I couldn't disagree more. As I explained, this secret sauce of these trading companies is embedded in this source code. So if there isn't a check in place to make sure that the SEC is only getting its hands on it when absolutely necessary, that's why you need the subpoena. That gives the reason. They can't just come in willy-nilly and get it. They have to make sure that they need it. And if we don't do this, then we are putting our trading companies at great risk and investors at great risk, especially since recent cybersecurity threats have grown so much lately. There's no telling if the SEC could properly even secure this vital information without being hacked. So I don't think it's too much to be able to get the subpoena to do this. That means it's necessary because these computer programs execute the trades at lightning speeds. And so I want to just recall, if you know, not too long ago, the SEC had a flash crash, and it took them 2 weeks to respond. Now, our bill does nothing to change the ability of the SEC to access data of the registrants. It simply establishes a reasonable process for accessing that information. Our financial system is vital. It's a national security issue. And we have to make sure that both ends are tightened, not only with what the regulators are going after, but after they get it, they got to know how important it is from the individuals. That's their lifeblood. And so I would hope that we would be able to see that. And I want to thank Mr. Duffy for having the foresight to kind of get ahead of this and make sure that they get a subpoena before they get the secret sauce. Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I do want to thank Congressman Duffy and Congressman Scott for their hard work on this legislation. This topic of data security and protecting intellectual property is a topic that frequently comes up when I'm speaking with my constituents back in Illinois. It's also especially timely given the data breach at the SEC that was recently made public. The legislation we're considering today is straightforward. It amends the Securities Act, the Exchange Act, the Investment Company Act, and the Investment Advisor Act so that the SEC is not authorized to compel a person to produce or furnish source code, including algorithmic trading source code or similar intellectual property, to the Commission unless the Commission first issues a subpoena. House of Representatives already agreed to similar legislation when Mr. Duffy and Mr. Scott from Georgia had a bipartisan amendment to the CFTC reauthorization to protect intellectual property at the beginning of this Congress. I voted in support of this amendment because I recognize that almost the entire value of some companies is embodied in its source code, and we need to have a strong check in place before our government can demand such information. This is not some hypothetical issue. Every member of this committee knows very well that the Securities and Exchange Commission recently suffered a very severe data breach. In general, we need to be thinking very critically about what information we want to trust the SEC with holding. I hope this is the last time the SEC is a victim of such a hack, but it would be ignorant for us to think the attacks on its computers will stop. I know Chairman Clayton is working diligently to protect the information that's entrusted to the Commission, but we have an opportunity to make his job a little simpler by reconsidering what information the Commission should have access to and how easily they should have it. Without proper controls in place, there's also a risk that personnel at the SEC might make improper use of their authority to supervise or examine market participants. Last year, the SEC's Office of Inspector General's semi-annual report to Congress made note of an investigation into personnel unnecessarily requesting proprietary trading code from registrants to illegally download this code onto his personal computer. The OIG investigation found no evidence that the subject came into possession of property source codes, but they did find that this same person was untruthful with his supervisor about the nature of his foreign travel, misrepresented commuting costs when applying for travel benefits, did not properly clear the sale of a security in accordance with the SEC's supplemental ethics rules. The point is, while the vast majority of the employees working at the SEC are upstanding public servants, there may be some bad actors who are in a position to make personal gain. In this case, there was a rumor among market participants that this individual was requesting source code from companies to make himself more competitive in the event he left the agency to work in the private sector. I want to emphasize that this is a rumor, but it is a scenario that makes these companies extremely nervous. This bipartisan legislation will address concerns I have been hearing from the trading community back in Chicago since the CFTC first proposed regulation automated trading, or Reg AT, which would have set up a source code repository at the agency. In his dissent, CFTC Commissioner Giancarlo, now chairman, noted the importance of requiring a subpoena to be issued. In his statement of dissent, he says, and I quote, "The subpoena process provides property owners with due process of law before the government can seize their property. It protects owners of property, not the government that already has abundant power. It allows property owners an opportunity to challenge the scope, timing, and manner of discovery and whether any legal privileges apply to the process of surrendering property to the government. The subpoena process, therefore, provides a fair compromise between the rights of property owners and the government's right to seize their property. Without the subpoena process, there is no balance between the civil liberties of the governed and the unlimited power of the government. As a foundation of civil liberties, the subpoena process precedes the American Republic, going back to English common law. As a legal principle, it was woven into the Bill of Rights. As a bulwark of modern civil society, it protects the liberty of the governed from the tyranny of the government," end quote. The legislation we're currently debating is this committee's opportunity to codify the protection of property rights that Chairman Giancarlo so eloquently described in the context of the CFTC. We must also act so that property rights are not infringed upon by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is within the jurisdiction of this committee. I'd urge all of my colleagues to vote in support of this bipartisan legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For who seeks recognition? For what purposes?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
While offered under the guise of due process and intellectual property protections, H.R. 3948 would provide a windfall for hedge funds and high-frequency traders seeking to avoid regulatory oversight of their potentially disruptive automated trading systems. Specifically, this bill would undermine the SEC's ability to conduct compliance examinations and effectively respond to significant market anomalies by imposing an overly broad and unwarranted subpoena requirement before SEC staff could inspect computer data. Let's not forget that on May 6, 2010, in an event referred to as the flash crash, major U.S. stock indices plummeted nearly $1 trillion in less than an hour. Alarmingly, the SEC and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, CFTC, took nearly 5 months to determine that the flash crash was caused by a combination of a flawed execution algorithm of one institutional investor and aggressive algorithmic trading by HFTS. In response to the flash crash, the SEC and other regulators have worked to improve their ability to quickly discover the cause of computer-driven market disruptions which threaten market stability and investor confidence. This bill would hamper the SEC's market surveillance efforts in favor of the parties responsible for the flash crash by erecting procedural hurdles to access algorithmic trading data and other information that firms regularly include in their books and records. Moreover, H.R. 3948 extends far beyond reasonable intellectual property protections and would require SEC examination staff to obtain a subpoena before it could inspect any source code whatsoever. This would include, for example, computer code reflecting a firm's adherence to certain cybersecurity regulations, obstructing the SEC's access to such information during a compliance examination could prolong investor exposure to undetected cybersecurity risk This bill would impose serious unintended consequences on investors and our markets. Unfortunately, without a legislative hearing, this committee has been unable to properly examine these consequences. Investors deserve the SEC's best efforts in investigating and mitigating computer-driven market disruptions, just as American public deserves the committee's best efforts in fully vetting legislation in accordance with regular order. For these reasons, I oppose H.R. 3948, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll try to make this quick. Former SEC Chair White was posed a question directly about the SEC's ability or desire to do what the CFTC did with Reg AT, and the SEC has not denied whether it may follow the CFTC's lead and propose regulations that allow them to also seize the source code and other intellectual property without requiring a subpoena. This ought to alarm everybody. With protecting our intellectual property is a cornerstone not only of our free enterprise system, it's also a cornerstone of our Constitution, the foundation of our government. And when we are allowing regulators to go in and at their own discretion, there's a vote from the commissioners with the CFTC that would allow this to have them to basically take this secret sauce, the proprietary data. In my book, that's a takings. That is a governmental takings of property. And given the recent breach of Edgar and valid concerns that GAO has put forward and other inspectors generals about the ability for the government to protect sensitive data, it seems to me it's even more important to put safeguards in place on whether it's the SEC or anybody else to make sure that they are not able to just move forward at their own discretion. And I commend my friend and colleague from Wisconsin. I think his bill balances due process rights as well as cybersecurity concerns while preserving the SEC's ability to obtain the information in its normal course. But let's not give them extraordinary measures. Let's make sure that they too have to abide by the legal buffers that keep those that they regulate in line. And with that, Mr. Chairman,
Would the gentleman from Michigan yield?
I'm happy to yield to my friend from Wisconsin.
Thank you. And I just, not that I necessarily agree with the ranking member's point, but I understand where she's coming from. And I think it's important to note here is all we're asking for is a subpoena. And in a prior life, I used to be a prosecutor, and sometimes subpoenas can take a little while. But in extraordinary circumstances, which the ranking member mentioned, subpoenas happen very, very, very quickly. And so if you need access, you can get it immediately. But as the gentleman from Michigan pointed out, these safeguards are important constitutional protections that we think are necessary to continue to preserve. So I understand your point, but taking this extra step of garnering a subpoena in extraordinary times, I don't think will inhibit access to information as she has laid out. So I think this is common sense, and that's why I appreciate the support again from Mr. Scott, who has given thoughtful insight on this issue and wants to make sure we're also protecting our Constitution as well. With that, I'd yield back to the gentleman.
I appreciate that, and I too want to commend not only yourself but our colleague from Georgia, Mr. Scott, and the work that I know has gone into this. There have been times where ideas have been proposed. The minority has objected, but they, for the most part, have been constructive criticisms and have been willing to work with the majority side. And as we're seeing with the vast number of bipartisan bills that we are dealing with here today, the American people should take heart that it can work. And it does work more than gets reported, frankly, out there oftentimes. But this is a positive step forward, a good bipartisan solution, and commend everybody who's been involved in crafting this. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Foster, page 2, line 11, strike.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment will simply strike 4 words from 4 sections of the bill to narrow the set of documents that would require a subpoena. As someone who can code in at least 7 languages, I understand that source code is qualitatively different from other documents that a firm might have and that our regulators should have legitimate access to. I think that it's important because of the sensitivity of the source code. They are truly the crown jewels of an electronic trading firm, and there are obvious dangers that have been exposed in transferring things really not just to the government, to any entity. The first line of defense in cybersecurity is to keep the data as closely held as reasonable and still be able to do your job. I believe that there will be instances when the source code is probably relevant. When the regulators have taken notice of what look like abusive trading practices, for example, they may actually want to see if their suspicions are confirmed by looking at the actual algorithms that are being used in this. But as many people have mentioned, there are real dangers to going too far. And so I think it's important that we narrow this as much as possible, but not more than that. And so by simply striking those 4 words, I believe that it clearly isolates the source code in a way that best expresses the intent of this bill. And finally, I was also made aware of a drafting error in the bill. The bill is intended to only apply to the algorithmic source code that the code that's prescriptive to trading actions. And we could, to fix this, we could, for example, strike source code, comma, including in each of the provisions to make this clear. It's my understanding that the chairman wants to spend more time looking at changes and this change to fix the drafting error. And I hope we can work together to make that fix before the final consideration on the floor. So I urge support of my amendment, and if adopted, this bill in its entirety, and I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I would encourage my colleagues to accept the amendment in this great effort of bipartisanship and for a strive to make some improvements. I would encourage acceptance, and if the gentleman wants to continue to work together, if he has other ideas on drafting or other provisions, I'd be happy to work with him as we move forward, hopefully to the floor. I would yield back.
I appreciate that, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose
Chairman.
does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly I'm inclined to support Mr. Foster's amendment, but it really does not deal with the very serious problems that this bill presents. And I'm reading now from a U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission release, where the SEC charges AXA Rosenberg entities for concealing error in quantitative investment model. The Securities and Exchange Commission charged 3 AXA Rosenberg entities with securities fraud for concealing a significant error in the computer code of the quantitative investment model that they used to manage client assets. The error caused $217 million in investor losses. So, to protect trade secrets, quantitative investment managers often isolate their complex computer models from the firm's compliance and risk management functions and leave oversight to a few sophisticated programmers. And this was said by the director of the SEC's Division of Enforcement, Mr. Robert Kazami. The secretive structure and lack of oversight of quantitative investment models, as this case demonstrates, cannot be used to conceal errors and betray investors. I think it's important for us to understand the seriousness of the problem. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purposes? Gentleman from Georgia seek recognition.
Strike the last.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, first I want to certainly congratulate Mr. Foster and let him know that I too fully support the Foster Amendment. But I want to say that in the process today, we found that additional drafting error which Mr. Foster mentioned, and hopefully we and Mr. Duffy agreed that we might be able to go. Mr. Chairman, during my earlier remarks, I talked about what the real juice is in this secret sauce. It's the algorithms. And if we could, while drafting the bill, and we didn't have this addressed in it, and I think Mr. Foster, I can't speak for him, but he was aware of this, and so I think we need to fix this. And I think also, if we're able to narrow the scope of this just to the algorithms and not just the overall source, it would get to some of the ranking members' concerns, because that's what we really need to do, is to make sure that that subpoena, the scope of the subpoena is just to the algorithms within the process. But right now, it is not narrowed to that. It just says the source code. So would the chairman be willing, as we move this along before we get it to the floor, to maybe look at that to see if something could be done?
If the gentleman would yield, I'm sure the sponsor of the bill and myself would be happy to work with the gentleman on the way to the floor.
Oh, very good. Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yield back.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Is there any further discussion or amendments to the bill? If not, the question now occurs on ordering the bill as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it, and the ayes have it. The bill as amended?
Mr. Chairman?
No. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
I'd ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5, Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. All pending matters before the committee having concluded, I expect the committee to reconvene on these pending matters at 1:15 p.m. tomorrow. The committee stands in recess.